The most powerful divine system was activated. A random reward was credited to the account with the balance already exceeding 1 million Mingbi. The guy woke up not in the best of moods, and scratching his head, he let out a tired sigh, having not slept well at all. The young man was named Lin Yu, and it had been 3 years since he had risen from the dead, which was also when the system had been activated. Walking to the sink in the bathroom, he uttered the word "close," and the door immediately shut behind him with a soft creak. Turning on the water, Lin Yu began to reflect as he looked at his own reflection in the mirror. It wasn't enough for him to have been resurrected. He had also been gifted with a system. It felt very much like the notion that he didn't need to struggle against adversity. However, he had over 9 trillion yuan in his balance, which he could only access after his death. Despite all of this, the young man was horrified to realize that he did not want to die and to again be in that world. Suddenly lifting his head, Lin Yu looked in shock at the red object in front of him. After the bloody inscription began to appear on the mirror, he recoiled from the sink in horror, covering himself with his hand and asking what was happening. With a mix of horror and fascination, he read the words that emerged from the blood, revealing that he had become the owner of a fifth of the beta version of an intense thriller game, and there were only 16 hours left until the countdown ended. Lin Yu knew for certain that this was not a hint from the divine system. The system would automatically manifest in his consciousness, and even without seeing it, he could discern whether it was the system or not. Without much thought, he reached out and with a finger touched the text, which indeed appeared to be written in blood. In that very moment, he was enveloped by a feeling he had experienced before. It seemed to him as if death was once again stalking him, and a monster was about to devour him. However, the substance on the finger, slowly evaporating, remained eerie without ceasing. The young man gazed at the vapors, recognizing that this strange, cold, and bloody scent was already familiar to him. Clenching his teeth, he uttered that it was the smell of death. And then, forcing himself to calm down, he thought about how exactly at midnight tomorrow the time would come to enter into the terrifying game. While he had time to search for information about her, given that he was in the 5th part, it seemed that the game had existed for a while. Therefore, he immediately typed "beta test of this game" into the search engine. For a while, a guy with a bored expression sat reading article headlines that meant nothing to him. Suddenly, he saw something on the screen that astonished him, and he loudly asked if it was what he was thinking about. In a note from an insider, it was stated that if he received an invitation written in blood, then, unfortunately, he could only confirm that this thriller game indeed exists. Mysterious events everywhere are the result of the return of thriller game players. A new official investigation center has been established specifically to deal with these thriller games. Those chosen by the game will enter a world of evil spirits and will be killed by them if they break the quest rules. In every quest, at least half of the participants perish. However, the survivors also gain the ability to control the ghosts and souls of the deceased within the game. The letter concluded with the sentiment that, ultimately, whether he lives or not depends solely on him, wishing him luck just as they wish it to all the other players. Lin Yu remarked that if there exist ghosts within the gaming world, then it's highly probable they would begin to appear in the real world as well. He also mused that perhaps passing this beta test could indeed be a good thing. Additionally, he possesses a system that should improve his survival odds. The emergence of the system itself is thanks to this game in the afterlife. With his hands clasped together, he smiled, suggesting that ultimately one cannot rely on external factors for survival, but must seize every opportunity. Approaching midnight, Lin Yu was already dressed and standing in the living room, glancing at his watch and remarking that this was all he could manage to do in the short time he had for preparation. As soon as midnight struck, a red glow began to emerge beneath the young man's feet. But this time it was slightly different. To his surprise and shock, the floor beneath him began to crack and collapse downward into a red hole, as if it were made of real glass. As the boy plummeted down, the system announced that the current quest was named Inn of the Afterworld, and the mission objective was to work diligently for 2 days and survive. Finally, he ceased to fall downwards and jumped onto a stone slab, immediately rising to one knee while extending an arm forward for balance. The young man gazed at the landscape before him. It seemed that this was indeed the Inn of the Afterlife. At that very moment, he noticed several other players materialize beside him who were clearly frightened. The guy watched them, clearly not expecting their lives to end up this way. They were, in fact, the other players of the quest. Suddenly, a bearded man raised his voice and remarked that it seemed like this time everyone else was a newcomer except for him. One of the girls immediately approached him and, with a flirtatious voice, asked if it was not his first time there. Immediately, the man replied loudly, affirming that it was indeed accurate. He was in the fourth group of beta players, having played through such a simulation once every half-month, and now he was in the fifth group. Both girls immediately cast an admiring glance his way, expressing that it was absolutely amazing. In the same instant, the man revealed his hand, covered in scars, and told them not to think it was too easy. Every previous quest had been deadly, and the survival rate for newcomers was even lower. Listening to him speak about the price he pays, both girls gasped in fear as well. Meanwhile, Lin Yu stepped forward, expressing his admiration for the fact that the elder brother had already survived so many quests alive. To the man's surprise, who didn't expect it, he was asked if he had any experience to share with beginners. Observing the young man, the man thought that this youth had a superior way of thinking compared to others, and he had what it took to survive the quest. Aloud, he grimly stated that ghosts in thrillers don't dutched him to kill without reason. As someone who had been there, he advised them to remember two things. Firstly, as they all well knew, the ghosts of the game only kill those who break the rules. And secondly, the key rules will be presented and suggested to them in a very straightforward manner. Observing him, the guy thought that it was almost exactly what he had learned the day before, which was very reliable. However, there was also the possibility that to survive himself, all others must be utilized and sacrificed. The door behind them opened, and they all instantly turned around in unison, looking that way with surprise. From the door emerged a frail old man who, coughing, made his way towards the players standing before him. And then, with a mad glint in his eyes, he said he was pleased to welcome them to their new job at the Hotel of the Afterlife. Coughing loudly again, the elderly man stated that he was the accountant of this Inn of the Afterlife, and had come to distribute assignments to everyone on the owner's orders. The boy, like everyone else, looked at the old man with fear, thinking that the old man's breath was so cold it left no doubt he was indeed an evil spirit. Meanwhile, the elderly man said that before they began their work, he needed to inform them about a few rules at the hotel. As they already know, these rules are set by death itself, and they cannot be broken in thriller genre games. Firstly, they must all perform their duties properly, whether they are working at the reception or in the storeroom. If they slack off or shirk their duties, in the end, the mistress will show them no mercy. The young man became thoughtful. It seemed that the accountant was also afraid of the mistress. In other words, the mistress was a more powerful and stern spirit than he was. As he pondered, the old man mentioned that secondly, everything in the shop was in a state of disrepair and could easily be damaged. If they broke anything, they would have to pay for it. Thirdly, they should not ignore the customers. Although they will not be punished for dealing with grumpy clients, if an excuse is found, not even the boss's wife will protect them. Having finished explaining the rules, the old man said, "Good," and asked if they had any questions. When no one responded, continuing to silently stare at him, he said that he would then assign them work. Pointing to a bearded man, he said he seemed strong. Therefore, he should go to the back of the kitchen to help the chef chop vegetables. He immediately complied and gloomily made his way to the entrance, already having a rough idea of what awaited him. Glancing back at Lin Yu for the last time, he silently wished him to take care of himself, for their beautiful flesh they looked lovely. And since that is the case, they will go work as waiters in a hotel. After all, they don't need to be taught how to take orders and serve food. Pointing at the door, the elder explained where and how to proceed. Then he mentioned his hope that they knew how to conduct themselves properly and would make no mistakes. The girl with pink hair immediately froze in fear, standing still and trembling without moving from the spot. Immediately, the young man took her hand and pulled her towards the entrance, saying that they should hurry. Only once they crossed the threshold and entered the room did Lin Yu release her hand, looking straight ahead. Finally noticing the boy, the girl thanked him and introduced herself. However, he interrupted her and said he would simply call her Xiao Li. And as for herself, she could call him Brother Lin. Privately, he thought about how that bearded player hadn't even introduced himself, so it was probably better not to use his full name either. The girl was surprised, but didn't think much of it, and after calling him Brother Lin, she thanked him. After a while, they entered the living room and started looking around, examining everything that was there. For a while, both remained silent, but then the girl turned to Lin Yu and asked what they were going to do next. After a moment of thought, he proceeded forward and announced that they would be expecting the guests. To himself, he thought that there was no time for fear. Every step forward was a challenge of life and death. But he immediately froze in fear alongside Xiao Li, staring at the monster before them that had arrived so unexpectedly. A massive spirit halted and with a booming voice announced itself with a cuckoo, thus blocking their way out. Upon seeing the people before him, the spirit drooled, remarking that there indeed appeared to be living humans. For a while, the young man didn't respond, trying to figure out how he should act in such a situation. Then he stepped aside and with a gesture invited the guest to enter, smiling warmly and suggesting that they should come in. Throughout this time, Xiao Li was trying hard not to scream in terror. The spirited enthusiasm had notably waned as he made his way inside, remarking about the presence of two waiters and musing that without his comment one might think they were merely serving up ingredients for a buffet. Both individuals watched as the monster took a seat at the table. The guy thought it was quite fitting for a thriller genre game that contains a hidden plot. A loud creak echoed as the sullen monster sat down on the bench. The thought crossed the boy's mind that it was fortunate the bench hadn't broken, otherwise he didn't know what they would have gotten themselves into. In the next moment, the monster pulled out and offered 2 coins, saying that first he should bring it a pot of hot water and a couple of plates. The guy immediately leaned in and with a friendly smile said, "Okay." Passing by the table, he glanced at what lay upon it. Those copper coins were familiar to him. However, he ceased to ponder further, approaching the kettle boiling over the fire. He was surprised by the devices standing there, which were, to put it mildly, very strange and eerie. Xiao Li was about to grab the kettle, saying she'd help, but the guy quickly moved her hand away. Lifting it, he remarked that the kettle was heavy, so he would handle it himself. After all, they couldn't afford to upset their guests should anything go awry. However, in the next instant, the kettle seemed to come to life and water began to pour out of it. He himself was dangling in the arms of the young man who had lifted him, shouting that he was hot and splashing water around. Hot water from the kettle splashed onto Lin Yu's hand, causing him to reflexively release his grip, dropping the handle. The kettle, in that very moment no longer held by anything, fell and shattered on the stone floor, while the water from it likewise spread across the floor. Observing him and then looking at the boy who kept silently staring at the kettle, the girl suggested they simply hide it. After assuming she simply wanted to leave everything to chance, the guy lifted his head and, scratching the back of his head, admitted his fear that it might not work out. Immediately behind them, the old man appeared, who, with a ghastly smile, said that the young man was fussy, barely starting work and already managed to break the teapot. Extending his hand, he mentioned, by the way, that this kettle costs 50 pieces and that he just started working, thus he cannot afford to pay for it. And with words declaring that he would take his hand, the one that broke the kettle, as compensation, he lunged at the guy. Xiao Li immediately covered her face with her hands and screamed loudly, unable to do or say anything. Lian Yu himself shouted loudly for it to stop and then, frowning, asked who said that he couldn't afford to pay. He then mentally called upon the system, stating his desire to withdraw 50,000 minbi and to pay in copper coins. A field of energy began forming around the boy towards whom the elderly man was still stretching his bony arms, causing the old man to stop in amazement, looking at him. Looking at him with frightened eyes, the old man wondered how such pure yin energy could reside within this person. It was even more powerful than the energy of the old man himself. And not just that, it was stronger than the mistress's energy as well. Meanwhile, bundles with money threaded through them began to appear on the boy's wrist. Tossing one of the bundles towards the old man, the young man said it was 1,000 yuan and asked if it was adequate compensation. The old man extended his arms in a protective gesture, looking down at the money that had fallen at his feet. Approaching them for a closer look and examining them carefully, he tried to understand how it could be possible. Thousands of wen would suffice to buy his ephemeral life, and he fears that if he were to offer 1,000 wen to have the client rid himself of the old man, he would gladly do it. He might even compel the mistress to carry it out. The money that the young man had withdrawn, judging by the bundles, clearly exceeded 5 guineas. The old man thought that this young man was definitely not a novice. Looking at Lin Yu, Xiao Li thought that he had truly amazed the ghost with his action. The young man himself thought, as he looked at the elder, that even a phantom would subconsciously worship him at the sight of the divine system. Still, just 50,000 could frighten him so, even with 9 trillion still in his possession. And he fears that his golden fingers are even more powerful than he imagined. Judging by the old man's reaction, it seemed that due to the restrictive rules, the evil spirit could not kill and take the treasure with impunity. Therefore, Lin Yu approached and, picking up the money, placed it in the old man's hands, saying that one should take it when offered. And could it really be that he is an accountant and yet does not know how to handle money? Reflecting on the fact that he had never seen so much money before, the old man remarked that it was a substantial amount, indicating that he had given him a generous sum of money. Looking at the system window in front of him, the guy said to leave them with him, thinking that he still had an assignment to complete. The first task was to spend over 100,000, and the reward for completing the task was a cashback card, along with 10 bottles of exquisite wine. Observing the task, the young man pondered the significant amount of money it required. The concept of a cashback card intrigued him, yet not in the same manner as the soul-cleansing infernal wine. Indeed, if one had the means, they might even make the devil turn the millstone. Yet it's possible that at some point the rules may become blurred. Therefore, to ensure one's safety, relying on one VJRTAM's own abilities is essential. Determined to complete the system's task as swiftly as possible, the young man picked up one of the plates and asked the old man how much it cost. The smiling old man replied that it costs 101 each. The guy loudly yelped, and in that same moment, as if by accident, knocked an entire stack of those plates to the ground. With loud shouts, shrieks, and a crash, the dishes fell to the ground and shattered into tiny pieces. As the boy watched this with a stony face, the girl, not understanding his motives, looked on in fear. The old man looked down at the shattered plates with the same frightened expression, unsure of the consequences this would lead to. Meanwhile, Lin Yu leaned in and extended the money to him, saying that he should accept it as compensation. Moreover, he should consider himself as being there for the first time and wanting to make friends with everyone in the Afterlife Hotel. Watching him, the old man thought that no matter who this young man was or what his purpose might be, it presented a wonderful opportunity. Thus, with a smile, he said that he dared not become his friend, but if in the future he faces any difficulties, he would be there for him. The guy smiled back and said it was no big deal and he could just set aside the money for now somewhere. And then he turned towards the other plates that stood there, looking at his not-so-pleasant smile with a frightened gaze. However, a sudden feeling made him stop and stand in place, bewildered. A voice called out, asking him to stop and abide by the rules, warning that if he continued on this path, their restaurant would go under. The guy smiled, thinking that the voice didn't sound like that of an evil ghost at all, but rather was soft in tone, and it seemed to him that the owner was not indifferent to the sight of money. Casting a sidelong glance at another teapot, this one normal, the guy thought it was a pity that exchanging the money for the task completed in such a way was no longer possible. Taking the kettle, he headed towards the monster and apologized for making it wait. Then he placed the kettle directly in front of him on the table, thinking that if this was to his liking, the guy would pay for it. But the monster didn't mention anything about being late. In fact, it said quite the opposite, amiably stating that everything was fine and it wasn't in a hurry. This caused everyone present to stand frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening with the monster. The monster itself sat with its head bowed, reflecting on the man's ability to find things in the void, beyond speaking of his wealth. It feared that a great person was behind this, and so how could it bear any resentment towards such an individual? Looking at him, the young man let out a chuckle, figuring out what was really going on. Then he approached the monster more closely and fervently declared that in any case it was he who was at fault for having detained it for so long. Upon hearing his offer to pay for his lunch, the monster thanked him and awkwardly scratched his head. Meanwhile, Lin Yu pointed to the rack with the menu offerings and stated everything was fine, insisting there was no need to be modest with him, so one should feel free to order anything from the menu. The monster pointed ahead and asked, "How about one of each item on the menu?" The guy immediately thought that the monster seemed to be reading his mind, yet this still wasn't enough. Meanwhile, the old man mentioned that if he only wants one dish, it might be too little. He offered to help him place an order at the kitchen's back office. Watching the monster, the guy darkened and stated that in that case, they would just go ahead with their plan, ignoring the monster's words about him being reckless. Then he turned towards the others, speaking grimly and confidently, stating that now it was time to get to work and that they should prepare 2 servings of each dish, totaling over 30 wen. The old man immediately stated that it was a total of 830 wen, and they could add another 0 to that amount. The young man said that if that was the case, then it was all good and let there be 1,000 wen. At that moment, the jaws of everyone who heard him dropped. After they finished the service, the boy and the girl stood together in a corner. All the while, the boy thought about how he only had 60,000 at the moment, and it still wasn't enough. Xiao Li suddenly spoke up, catching the attention of the boy as she was about to ask him something. But it was precisely at that moment that a brilliant idea for spending the remaining sum dawned upon the young man. He immediately turned to the girl and grabbed her by the shoulders, saying that she arrived just in time as he had a request for her. After all that had transpired, the girl stepped outside with the promotional sign in hand, pondering that this was not quite how she had imagined it. After a while, she brought the sign back, and by then, a huge number of monsters had already gathered at the tables in the inn. One of the monsters said that normally he would not dare to consume the essence of bloody food in such a manner. However, thanks to Mr. Lin Yu, his yin energy could increase by several points. The second monster declared that the coins he employed were not only imbued with yin energy, but were also entirely novel. Such a thing could not be acquired from ordinary people, implying that he might be a chosen representative of the king. The third group of monsters at the table were discussing whether or not Mr. Lin had ever been married. However, what truly surprised the young woman was not this, but the fact that Lin Yu was calmly drinking wine with the guests, as if everything were ordinary to him. This made the young woman think that Lin was no novice. He noticed her and waved his hand, saying she had done a good job. Meanwhile, the monster asked if the accountant could serve another energizing soup to treat Xiao Li. The guy immediately brought over another bundle of money, mentioning that he had left it at the registration desk. Meanwhile, the system finally announced that the total cost of the task had exceeded 10,000. It congratulated him on successfully completing task number 1. Looking at the system window where all this was written and the prizes were indicated, the guy happily thought that it was finally completed. In the next instant, one window swiftly transitioned to another, revealing his awards, and the boy thought that an inventory feature must have been added to the system. The only item there was a soul-cleansing wine from hell. Consuming it increased the strength and spiritual awareness of ghosts, as well as their level. One could drink no more than 3 bottles, after which it would be ineffective to consume more. He immediately took out one of the bottles, thinking that it was exactly what he needed the most. Only when you are strong can you truly control your fate. Gazing at the bottle that had materialized in his hand, the young man continued to contemplate the importance of not wasting time. Therefore, he decided to use the soul-cleansing wine of hell right away, aiming to become the master of ghosts. The monsters immediately sensed the aroma of wine that filled the room where they were sitting. This scent was emanating directly from the boy's bottle, which materialized out of nowhere. The monsters began to inquire about its nature, intrigued by its tremendous and pure yin energy, and Master Lin's skills were unfathomable. Meanwhile, the guy lifted the bottle, and having spoken, he said he was drinking to all of them. Without hesitation, he immediately downed the contents of the bottle, not considering what ingredients it might contain. As soon as he drank it, he immediately felt a pure and cold aura. Deciding right then that it was indeed the yin qi, the system immediately informed him of his current characteristics, and that the owner was attaining spiritual consciousness for the first time and unlocking the attribute panel. Lin Yu silently observed and read what was written on the system's emerging windows. With his arms crossed on his chest, he pondered how merely by drinking a bottle of wine, he had opened up his spiritual consciousness and become a master of first-level ghosts. The system's reward for the wine of hell was, in his opinion, very favorable, as it did not go to waste. Meanwhile, the system notified him of another task, this time requiring him to spend over 30,000 mingi on a single transaction. In the rewards for the quest he had contemplated as he read the task, it was mentioned that he would be given a contract for a master-level ghost lord. Now, the young man believed that with this contract, both he and his power would ascend to a new level. He must find a way to complete the mission as quickly as possible. Turning to the drinking monsters, he silently stared at them. They definitely were no longer an option worth spending on. The green monster was terrified by the thought that his master's aura wasn't strong, but he was immensely generous, carrying with him a spirit of fine wine. Thus, he feared that his true essence was that of a great power with a wounded soul. Getting up from his seat, he thought that he would simply return the favor. And it wasn't flattery as one might think. Kneeling on one knee, he declared he would be magnanimous and henceforth refer to Mr. Lin as Brother Lin. Having obtained a certain artifact, he handed it over to the guy and expressed his deep embarrassment for having offered him food earlier that day. Therefore, this is a yin tool that he would like to present to Brother Lin Yu. With words explaining that he had owned the mirror for many years yet never knew its true purpose, he handed it over to the young man. He immediately took it and looked at the glass, thinking about how odd this yin instrument was. After all, the mirror showed nothing. To his surprise, the system immediately notified him that it had discovered the yin instrument, the QG Elgin Soul Sharpening Mirror, and it was now bound to its master. With a certain awkwardness, the monster said that it didn't believe its true effects would be so simple, implying that leaving it in its possession would be wasteful. It thought that the item might be of use to the boy instead. He waved the mirror from side to side and, with a smile, said that the mirror was indeed a good thing and that it would come in handy for him. The monster and the girl immediately looked at him in shock, and the monster decided that it must have already understood his true essence. Meanwhile, Lin Yu summoned the system and stored the mirror in the vault, not wanting to carry it everywhere with him. The monsters, even more shocked, stared at the scene before them, thinking it must surely be a spatial treasure vault. The green monster pondered the fact that the origins of this human were unknown, yet it must surely lie in deeper realms. Suddenly another monster spoke up, addressing him as Mr. Line and stating that it had a treasure for the young man. With the words that there was no need to be so polite, the young man approached the elderly man and inquired about what he had there, thinking to himself that he initially just wanted to complete a quest, not get involved in all this. The monster pulled out a necklace and declared that it was the necklace of feud skulls, which could be worn for soul protection. Additionally, it had the ability to store infused yin energy and release it as a counterattack when needed. In reality, the monster thought that the boy might not find this feature useful, but as a piece of jewelry, the necklace was splendid. The system immediately notified the young man that the necklace was bound to him. He had thought it was not as advanced as the mirror, but this practical offensive and defensive treasure suited him best at this stage. The other monsters said they had nothing else to offer, so they proposed to give him a portion of their primordial energy to be stored in his necklace. As soon as all that energy reached the necklace, the boy immediately felt much stronger. With hands clasped in a respectful gesture, the young man smiled and thanked everyone for their gifts. Immediately, the monsters, with charming smiles and a hint of embarrassment, responded that there was no need for him to thank them. Standing off to the side, Xiao Li awkwardly scratched her head, thinking that this was even more flattering than when her father's subordinates sent paintings. Now she was curious if it was indeed a thriller game. Sometime later, after they had closed for the day, everyone was sitting in the dining area. The elderly man spoke, stating that thanks to Mr. Lin, today's turnover had increased by more than 5 times compared to previous days. Looking out onto the street, the boy thought it was no wonder they had to leave so hastily before night fell. After experiencing this rising and falling yin and yang, he feared it had become unsafe for these spirits. Suddenly, the voice of the hostess was heard announcing that the day shift had ended, so they should all gather in the hall and prepare for dinner. Ignoring the girl's words about her interest in how the others were doing, the boy thought that it was time to meet the other ghosts in the tavern. After all, they might not be as kind to his money as the accountant. Suddenly, right before their eyes in midair, a blood-red inscription began to appear, causing them considerable astonishment. To their horror, the message that appeared in the air announced that the number of current survivors in the game had reached 4. The girl said in a frightened tone that it was only the first day, yet they already had 2 casualties. Lin Yu coldly replied that it was because this quest had a low survival rate. Having stopped looking at the inscription that had already vanished, the boy sat back down at the table and grew gloomy. Looking at his hand, the guy thought that he would have lost at least his hand if he had been any slower in pulling out the money. And even those very friendly phantom guests would have tried to make him their dinner had he not offered and bought them food and drink. Upon touching the necklace, he realized that it was fortunate he now had capital in addition to the minbi. He was certain that this would enable him to save his life. The old man approached and wiped the table, saying that later they would dine together there, as it was a tradition in the afterlife. In the next moment, a voice behind him inquired why he treated the new runner with such respect. Afterward, everyone seated in the living room could see the very girl entering, driven by a ghost wielding a broom. Xiao Li immediately exclaimed in fear, stating she couldn't believe she had turned into this. Lin Yu, in turn, grimly stated that the blonde who had been in her group didn't show up, which meant that he had died. Observing how they sat there calmly, whole and unharmed, the girl asked if they had really done nothing at all. When no one replied, the girl's mood darkened and she decided to remain silent and return to her seat. Observing how she trembled with anger, the man thought that if he didn't possess spiritual awareness, he would not have been able to recognize the turmoil in this woman's heart. Despite his awareness, he also understood that given her capabilities, she should not be able to inflict any harm on him. In the next moment, the young man turned back to look at the old man and the woman who were staring intently at each other and thought that, on the contrary, in the hotel of the afterlife, not everything was as harmonious either. To the woman's surprise, the old man stated that she knew nothing, and that she finds pleasure in tormenting her subordinates, while he needs to accumulate more good deeds. Turning to the guy, she told him to go and clear the table, or else he was simply neglecting his job and didn't want to do anything. Noticing that he hadn't moved, the woman swung a broom at him, declaring that since the old ghost Lee was weak, she would punish him on his behalf and would make him aware of the hotel's rules. The girl with purple hair immediately smiled at this, genuinely pleased that he would be punished. Xiao Li, in turn, opened her mouth in fear, suspecting what was to come. However, nothing happened, and as soon as the broom swished towards the boy's head, a magical shield immediately surrounded him. Shocked upon seeing the necklace around the guy's neck, the woman jumped back in fright, still clutching the broom in her hands. The guy, in turn, looked down on her with disdain, thinking it was simply ludicrous, for her strength couldn't possibly reach the level of a ghostly general. After a moment of thought, the ghost announced that what it relied upon turned out to be a mid-tier yin weapon. With a smirk, the ghost eventually took a seat at the table directly opposite the young man, beginning to bore into him with her gaze. Lin Yu gloomily thought that Zhang Nian clearly harbored resentment towards him. If she were given the chance, she would definitely kill him. His safety today was due to the fact that the ghosts feared him, for they did not know who he was. But if he couldn't rid himself of it, he feared that Li, or even the mistress, would see that he was merely a fraud. In such a case, he will indeed be in big trouble. Therefore, he must find a way to get rid of it as soon as possible. Suddenly, there was a knock, and everyone turned in shocked surprise toward the direction it came from. Behind the woman, doors opened, and a large man with a scowling face entered. Both ghosts at the table immediately lowered their heads in fear, not daring to raise them and look at him. Lin Yu immediately thought that this man was a chef, and judging by the feeling of spiritual awareness, he must be an even more powerful being than those ghosts. Meanwhile, the cook instructed the man who had followed him to come in and place the pot he had brought on the table. He immediately obeyed and, with a sullen face, walked over to the table, promptly setting the pot down on it. The young man noticed something that shocked him. The other guy now lacked an arm. Meanwhile, the cook opened the pot and, paying no attention to anyone, announced that dinner was served. In the pot, there was a mixture of a strange shade of purple in which eyes, bones, and even glasses floated. Xiao Li picked up her chopsticks with a gaze of horror, but was so terrified that she couldn't utter a word as she looked at him. A girl with violet hair, grasping her chopsticks, picked up the glasses and hair and asked if this could be what she was thinking about. The chef, who was standing behind her, asked if she didn't like his cooking. However, she responded that she liked everything. The chef burst into laughter and said that in that case she should eat in silence. Lin Yu turned to the man and, pointing to the bench, told him that he could sit there. With a glance, he observed the chef opening a bottle of wine, a selection not even the glass seemed thrilled about. It was clear to everyone that to doubt this chef's culinary skill and not to appreciate his food would provoke in him a desire to kill. Meanwhile, the cook had already poured himself a glass of wine and, ordering the cup to be quiet, downed it in one gulp, after which he started to grimace as he consumed it in large gulps, and the guy thought that he finally found a lead. Having consumed all the contents of the mug, the cook placed it back on the table with a loud thump, exhaling heavily. After noticing that Lin Yu was not eating anything, he pointed at him and asked why he wasn't eating. With his arms crossed over his chest, the boy smiled easily, listening to his questions about whether he really didn't like the chef's cooking. With a scorching look, the chef approached closer and inquired whether the young man did not appreciate his culinary skills. The boy, in turn, said nothing. He simply stood up from his spot and walked over to him. Then he took the glass from his hands, stating that the drink was quite unpalatable, and inquired if it was not difficult for him to consume such a beverage. Without waiting for an answer to his question, the young man simply flipped his glass and poured its contents onto the floor. Everyone around him looked on in shock at the scene, thinking that he must surely be seeking death. The ghostly woman smiled. He should have thanked her because now she didn't have to do everything herself. Even the guy's damned necklace wouldn't be able to stop this brute. Xiao Li thought that everything was not as it seemed, and judging by how the burly man looked before, he really did not like this beverage. Meanwhile, the cook's expression darkened, and with anger he called him a scoundrel and asked if he was truly provoking him. Sensing a certain smell, he instantly fell silent and lowered his head, peering at the bottle in the boy's hands from which it emanated. Lin Yu asked how he could have even thought about provoking him, given that his culinary skills are indeed worthy of all praise. But the tasting ones are much better, so it's simply unbearable for him to see the other drinking such rough wine. And so he offers him to try his wine. Observing how the guy poured it, the chef thought that if this was just another attempt by the cheeky scumbag to irritate him, he would definitely smash his head. Deciding that he was right in some aspect and that this wine indeed was better than what he always ordered from the tavern, the cook sat down on the bench. With words indicating he would try the wine, he took the cup from the young man. Without much thought, he poured the entire contents directly into his mouth, not considering the idea of savoring it. The sensations that the wine bestowed upon him were simply magical. Even the fact that he downed it in one gulp couldn't spoil or negate that. He was certain that it was the purest yin qi, and it was cleansing the chef's soul. This gave him a feeling that only through this wine could he elevate the kingdom. Slamming the cup down on the table with a loud clunk, the chef quickly and loudly stated that it was good wine, in fact, very good wine. Watching him, the young man thought that everything was exactly as he had suspected. It would be no trouble at all to bribe him with some soul-cleansing wine. Thus, with the word suggesting that they should have another cup, he poured more wine into the cook's cup. He looked at her with surprise, taking it in his hands, oblivious to the expression of the mug itself, which was clearly content with its contents. After that, the chef began to slowly sip the wine, exclaiming with delight that it was absolutely marvelous. The guy was also smiling, reflecting on how he had seen the wine bottle empty and had stopped gulping it down. Indeed, as he had thought, the wine was more potent than he could have imagined. The young man used the system to replace the bottle in his hands with a new one that was identical. Afterwards, he showed it to the cook, who, surprised, asked if he still had any wine left. Smiling, Lin Yu responded that of course he did, and asked if he should pour another cup for his dear friend. To the surprise and shock of everyone else, the chef said yes and thanked the guy, calling him little brother. Both ghosts were shocked by such behavior from the spirit. After all, he had just seriously called the young boy his little brother. Following this, the woman thought that he was still a worthless little man, incomparable to a spirit, and in that place he was destined to meet his doom. As the young man poured more wine into the cook's cup, he expressed his dismay with a casual yet poignant remark, saying, "What a pity." The cook asked him in surprise what he meant by pity, since he had mentioned that the guy had good wine. The guy explained that the pity lies in the fact that he won't be able to fully enjoy the aroma of this soul-cleansing infernal wine. If only they had some snacks, then it would be a different story. The cook, with immediate readiness, drew his sword and declared that he was right, momentarily forgetting that he was, in fact, a cook. Shaking his head, Lin Yu replied that he was well aware of his impeccable culinary skills, but he had overlooked that the local ingredients were subpar. No matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to achieve his culinary ideal. With a sly smile, he said it was because there was so much spectral qi there, and that was why their products were so tainted. And then, without removing the smile from his face, he asked whether cooking with ghosts wasn't dreadful. The cook, without pausing, thoughtfully kept repeating his words about how dreadful it is to cook with ghosts. After that, he stood up and loudly stated that it had finally dawned on him. Placing his hand on the guy's shoulder, he expressed his regret that he hadn't had the chance to meet him sooner. Both ghosts, upon being looked at by him, shivered, anticipating what was to come. The woman with the broom immediately jumped up and asked what he was thinking. After all, she had not insulted him. Moreover, all who work in the Hotel of the Afterlife must adhere to the established rules. Lin Yu immediately thought of the rules, but of course it was clear that for the indigenous ghosts in this game, killing their kind was not prohibited by the rules. Old Man Lee immediately responded to the woman's assertions that she had not insulted him with questions about her actions, highlighting that, after all, she had attacked his younger brother not long before this. The young man stood and listened with a frown as Elder Lee said that nothing had occurred, and she had simply overstepped her authority. All of it was done with the aim of harming an employee under his supervision. So it was she who first broke the sacred rules of the hotel. The woman asked fearfully who exactly he wanted to seek revenge for. She then grabbed a broom and swung it at the old man, intending to kill him and say something else as a final word. However, at that very moment, with all his might, the cook hurled a sword in her direction, which instantly pinned her to one of the living room walls. The ghostly woman immediately cried out, questioning how he could behave in such a way, even if the mistress herself had pleaded for him to take control. The chef approached her, stating that in the hotel of the afterworld there's a rule whereby during dinner unfounded actions towards the staff are not permitted, and she was the first to break these rules. Grasping the hilt of his sword, he stated that the elder was a fine worker, who labored hard and treated others with kindness. Thus, she was guilty of an additional transgression. The ghost immediately let out a loud "No," but the cook paid no attention to this or to her attempts at justification, quickly drawing his sword, and thus defeating the ghost, who immediately fell to her knees and then onto the wooden floor of the hotel. Lin Yu watched in horror as the chef effortlessly lifted the ghost's body, thinking about how he hadn't expected his friend to kill her within seconds. Stepping outside, the cook told him that he would go and take care of the ingredients and asked the young man to save some wine for him. He immediately nodded in response, thinking that this chef was indeed stronger than expected, and it seemed they wouldn't have to worry about a nighttime attack from this ghostly woman. Yet this frightened old man, it was clear, also intended to use her to test himself. Without uttering a single word, the young man approached the trembling old man Li, who, paralyzed by fear, could not say anything to him either. Lifting one of the pitchers, Lin Yu thanked the ghost for taking care of them and asked if it would mind if he made a toast in its honor. Meanwhile, he thought he would be punished as an example for the others. The old man trembled even more. He understood that this young man was not only wealthy, but had also compelled the cook to slay the ghostly woman with but a few words. And judging by his demeanor, he intended to later tell the general to have the old man drink all the wine. But he knew that if he drank it now, he'd be a goner. Yet, the guy could ask him to deliver a toast without a drink, although that would be impolite. For a while, he sat there, frantically trying to force himself to think. And finally, he came up with the idea of offering a treasure. It was the same during the day as far as he could remember, when the master made a toast and the ghosts responded in kind. Though Master Lin was wealthy, he seemed to not mind receiving gifts from others. The old man immediately began rummaging through his sleeves, pondering that, in any case, this was not needed in the hotel of the afterlife. Finally finding what he had been searching for, he extended the item to the young man, mentioning that he had found this object from his early years. With a drawl on the O, Lin Yu looked at the elderly man with a smile, pondering how this coward truly was frightened. Meanwhile, the old man began to explain that this object is called petrified wood, and serves as an excellent material for crafting yin weapons, and this piece is of exceptional quality. The system immediately alerted the boy that it had discovered a material of the highest quality, yin, which made him think that it indeed was a good material. Taking the wooden cube from the old man's hands, he thought he would now accomplish the quest just like that. Tossing it in his hand a couple of times, he said with a smile that it was a good item, and he was curious for how much the old man intended to sell it to him. The old man immediately began to refuse the money and question how he dared to ask for money in exchange for what was given to him. Instead, he should just take it. However, the young man immediately approached him, stating that he was a man of principles and therefore could not accept such a valuable item for nothing. Old man Li nervously wondered if it could be that such was a rule for survival in this world according to the gentleman. In this world, survival requires its own set of rules. The chef's rules stated that he needed to chop wood, drink alcohol, slice vegetables, and so forth. The rules for the ghost woman dictated that she must keep everything in order. As for Li himself, his rules involved calculations, compensation, money, and everything along those lines. He was unaware of the guy's rules, if he had any at all. Without much thought, Elder Li decided not to argue and instead asked what the price for the young man would be. He immediately retrieved several bundles of money from the storage and stated that his price was 3 guan. Immediately after, he threw those bonds on the elder. Observing them, the elder instantly burst into tears of happiness. He then stated that it was not a plea for mercy, but rather a chance for him. Continuing to gaze at Lin Yu, the old man feared that with these 3 guan coins, his purchase agreement with the lady might be annulled 10 years earlier. Deciding that he hadn't done enough for the young man, the elder bowed to him, expressing gratitude for his generosity, and he began to flail against the floor amidst the astonished gazes of onlookers, seemingly oblivious to everything as he did so with a loud noise. Watching this, the man furrowed his brow, wondering how the newcomer could possibly have made the ghost bow. However, everything would have made sense and been understandable if he had known for certain that the guy was one of those legendary individuals from a family of exorcists. The guy paid no attention to them, focusing instead on the system windows, which indicated that he had successfully completed the mission and obtained the Ghostmaster's contract. Reading what was written in the system's window, Lin Yu thought that if he was correct with the Ghostmaster contract, he could make ghosts fight for him, an absolute level ghost by ordinary contracts. Here he finally noticed Old Man Lee at his feet, who continued to express his gratitude. As he looked at him, he thought only that such a fine thing should not be wasted on such a child. There had to be another way. In the next moment, the chef reappeared, entering the parlor with the announcement that he had finished preparing the dish made from the ghost. On the plate, which he brought along with the pot, lay neatly and thinly sliced pieces of meat. The chef immediately warned that it was his first time preparing this dish and suggested that the man should try to eat it. Holding a piece with his chopsticks, Lin Yu thought that this chef truly excels at cooking. This food contains yin energy, which serves as an excellent tonic for everyone. After pondering for a moment, he placed the meat in his mouth and, after chewing, swallowed it. To his surprise, the system immediately notified him that the soul of a powerful ghost had been consumed and his spiritual power had increased. Looking at his updated data, the guy joyfully thought that she was indeed capable of increasing spiritual power. Turning to the chef, Lin Yu gave a thumbs up and said that it was truly delicious, nutritious, and hygienic. The chef joyfully uttered that it seems he liked it and took his wine cup from the table. The guy, in turn, poured some wine into it and clinked his cup, which also contained wine, with the chef. Meanwhile, everyone else simply stood and watched as the two of them ate and drank without bothering anyone. Ling Yu continued to devour the meat on his plate without pause, thereby increasing his strength with every bite. After some time, they finally finished eating and only dirty empty dishes remained on the table. The young man sighed deeply after such a hearty dinner, thinking to himself that merely by consuming food his spiritual power had reached 197. Meanwhile, the considerably tipsy chef was offering him his cup, remarking that it was a fine alcohol. The young man had thought himself to be the greatest problem for the quest, but now, thanks to the wine, everything had changed. Suddenly the voice of the hostess was heard, confidently stating that mealtime had come to an end. Then she turned to Old Man Lee, asking him to take them to rest. He immediately assured her that it would be done. The chef, with a disheartened expression, folded his arms across his chest and said it was a pity, but they were all out for the day. Afterwards, he turned and walked away, waving goodbye to the young man who had bid him farewell. The latter then thought to himself that it seemed the cook did not regard the mistress with the same reverence as the accountant did. Listening to how Elder Lee commanded everyone to clear the table, Lin Yu smiled, thinking that he would also help them clean up. However, in the next moment a voice was heard, compelling him to change his plans and instructing him to come to the third floor to meet her. Looking around, he noticed that no one else paid attention to it and wondered to himself if perhaps the hostess was sending him a message privately. Climbing upward, the young man was thinking about how to survive in this game. He had to use a lot of money, which caught the attention of the hostess. In truth, he thought she was the final boss of this quest, and the guy didn't know whether it was a blessing or a curse that she wanted to see him now. No sooner had he thought that the owner might indeed be there than the door swung open with a bang, and the boy entered the room, gazing at the ghost sitting before him. Lin Yu paused, slightly surprised to learn that she was actually the owner of the Afterlife's hotel. But considering the rules about murder she had set, he realized she couldn't kill him right away. So he confidently continued on his way. With his hands folded in a respectful gesture, he greeted the hostess and inquired if there were any matters that needed attention. The ghost replied that when Mr. Lin entered her parlor, her servant made a mistake and asked him to take on the duties of a waiter, for which she apologizes. The guy was shocked, unable to determine whether she was joking or genuinely apologizing to him. Waving his hand, he said not to worry and that she should enjoy her life. To himself, he thought that the mistress was a more formidable ghost than the others, and that she must not discover his true nature. In the meantime, the hostess hinted that Mr. Lin's standard of living truly turned her hotel upside down. The guy immediately said that he would compensate her for the dishes and utensils tenfold. The hostess immediately declared that the dishes were trivialities. Yet the ghostly woman had worked at this hotel for a century. Lin Yu responded with regret over the way the chef had killed her. However, he, being a novice waiter, and the two senior staff members being perplexed, was unable to dissuade the chef. The mistress, with anger, snapped her fan in two and stated that it was an inexplicable quarrel, but in such a case she would not engage in an argument with him. Activating her aura to its fullest, she said that even if he had a magnificent past, it didn't matter what purpose brought him to the hotel. But the people who provoked such a thing couldn't just be dismissed. The guy crossed his arms over his chest, watching her with a light smile, and asked what she wanted to say. She got down to business and stated that the woman had made a significant contribution, and without her, managing affairs would have been difficult. Therefore, he was now obligated to compensate for her death. The young man nearly burst into laughter at the realization that all of this was done to make amends. Regaining his composure, he earnestly inquired about what was considered a fair price for the demise of a ghost. After a moment of thought, the mistress confidently declared that she wanted 50 guineas for the ghost. Lin Yu immediately exhaled and thought that, upon full calculation, it turned out that one powerful ghost was equivalent to merely 500 kettles. Frowning, the guy called upon the system and requested it to use the cashback card. The system immediately complied and activated the card, causing money to materialize out of nowhere and fill the room where they stood. Observing how the lady eyed the money, the young man declared that he was giving her 50 guineas. Then he inquired about the possibility of her cook working for him now. The woman looked at the man in shock. The money he had offered was beyond anything she could have imagined. And then he inquired about purchasing an employee. This made her smile. Apparently, the boy was so wealthy he wanted to buy her chef. The guy thought that these grim ghosts were nothing more than tools for making money in the eyes of the mistress. He could see that the cook was also not thrilled about this place. The chef, strong, simple, and sociable, can overlook the disparity in levels with a perfect contract, allowing him to negotiate a deal. This option is the best for them and even the mistress. The hostess thought that the young man truly had his eye on the big guy from the back. But no matter how strong he was, to her, he was just a chef. But if it could be sold for a higher price, that would be better. With these thoughts in mind, she remarked that he had been with her for many years, and the inn would find it difficult to manage without the chef. Therefore, she immediately exclaimed, looking at him, that he should add more money. Without much thought or argument, the boy instructed the system to cash out $1 million for him. From nowhere, golden coins suddenly showered down, covering the entire floor of the room with such abundance that they carpeted the entire surface. The mistress looked at the falling money joyfully and told the young man that in such a case they had an agreement. Quickly pulling out the envelope containing the contract, she hurled it directly at the guy. The young man quickly caught the item thrown at him in midair without uttering a single word in response. Reading the terms of the contract, it seemed she was willing to sell the cook for 150 guineas. Considering how much he was supposed to earn and the duration of the contract, the cook's freedom was nothing more than an empty promise. He found it somewhat amusing, thinking the landlady to be quite cunning for having secured an open-ended contract so easily. The mistress said that all he needed to do was destroy the contract and the cook would become free. However, she did not guarantee that she would sign a new contract with the young man. He waved the contract at her and, heading toward the door, told her not to worry because he had his own plans. Without reaching the door, the guy turned around and asked if he were to sign a contract with her or even decided to buy the entire hotel. How much would she ask for it? For a while, the hostess simply remained silent and did not respond to him, pondering over her answer. Then she turned and succinctly replied that she would disappoint him, as neither she nor the hotel were for sale. The young man thought that money wasn't everything in this game and, folding his hands in a respectful gesture, said that in that case he wouldn't try to change her mind. Afterwards, he turned around and calmly walked towards the ghosts, but had even managed to charm the lady of the house. The man stated that, according to the hint he received, he truly must be a newcomer. Then he inquired whether it's possible that he might be from a secret family. Joining them in a circle, the boy replied that all of this, one way or another, was merely a series of coincidences. The man lowered his head and muttered grimly that indeed beings like him truly existed, though he had only heard about it on forums before. Lin Yu asked if he was saying that there was a forum for players to communicate with each other as part of an internal quest. The man nodded in agreement, after which he said that this was exactly what he had wanted to tell him from the beginning. He then turned to the others and inquired if they were aware of National Investigative Center No. 9. Xiao Li asked if it was true that they had started learning the game as reported. The man took out a card and explained that it was for them. They could call the number for the investigation center No. 9 after the game ended, and an official would come to meet with them for verification. Handing the card to the girl with violet hair, he explained that it could offer assistance to players, such as information and methods for weapon exchange. Then, with words explaining that their identity would be officially recognized by the state, equivalent to the status of a freelance associate, he handed the card to the young man. He looked at her silently, his mind utterly devoid of thoughts on the matter at hand or what he would do next. In the meantime, the man stated that this is what he is engaged in. Many joined them, and in the end, if they become full-fledged masters of ghosts, they will have the opportunity to change their status. Looking at the girls listening to him, the man continued to say that later, when they join forces with other full-fledged members, their chances of survival in the game would significantly increase. The guy handed the card back to him and asked if they were supposed to participate in the games from that point on as well. He confirmed that it was indeed the case, stating that players are summoned late at night and at odd hours every 2 weeks. He understood that some experts would be willing to pay a certain price for the chance to go the extra mile. After all, no matter how dangerous the game might be, it is full of opportunities. Then the guy inquired whether it was true that on the forum one had access to players from other thrillers besides Investigation Center Number 9. The man confirmed that this was true, and that it's an anonymous site managed by high-ranking ghost hunters. In response to his question about why it was anonymous, the man explained that there is a rule in the game according to which no one else can remember what you look like once you leave the quest and return to reality. As soon as the man declared that the forum was a barrier zone for those who didn't want to reveal their identity, the young man responded, "Understood." Then the man turned to the girls and asked if they had any questions, to which they shook their heads. After that, they went off to their beds, and the man said that, in that case, good night and good luck tomorrow. Late into the night, Ling Yu was awake, checking the system and everything that had been expended by him today. With an easy smile, he summoned the system and inquired about the new task. In the new task, it was stated that he must make 3 purchases, in which the cost of the item does not exceed 100,000 yuan, and the profit is more than 5 times the expense. The reward for completing the task this time was also different and much greater than in the previous 2 instances. Even before the sun had fully risen, the rooster began to wake everyone who was still asleep, heralding the arrival of a new day. Lin Yu was also sitting, leaning against the wall, and only opened his eyes when he heard that sound. Stretching, he thought to himself, here was yet another day in the world of ghosts, contemplating what it meant to be the master of ghosts. Although he hadn't slept all night, he felt no fatigue whatsoever. After what he had done yesterday, the cook was no longer hostile towards him, and nothing else happened during the night. Everyone else also stood up and exchanged good mornings, while the boy speculated that the remaining 3 had survived, albeit they seemed to be in less than high spirits. Upon hearing the loud knock on the door, everyone except the boy flinched and looked at the door with fear, wondering who it could possibly be. Lin Yu told them not to worry, explaining that it must be the accountant, and then he opened the door. Behind the door was indeed the accountant, who with a joyous smile announced that he had finally woken up. The young man didn't respond to this and asked where the accountant currently was. The elderly gentleman replied that he must be in the kitchen. Ignoring the old man's attempts to tell him about his work, the young man, with words indicating his understanding, walked towards the kitchen. The old man managed to restrain himself just in time from saying anything else about work, commanding himself to forget about it. After all, such a character no longer needed to adhere to the hotel's rules. He then asked everyone else what they were waiting for and instructed them to get to work. After glancing at the bearded man, he inquired why the big, dull fellow was simply standing around. And he said nothing, watching the young man walk away, thinking to himself that he truly was someone from an influential family. Upon reaching the kitchen and entering it, Lin Yu immediately called out to the chef, referring to him as brother, and wished him a good morning. The cook, in response, greeted him back and, pointing to a pot, suggested he try his freshly made bone broth while it was still hot. After looking at the boiling green goo in the cauldron, the guy declined it and told the cook that he had come to him on business. He immediately asked with surprise what the matter was, truly not understanding it. Lin Yu asked in response whether he was working at the hotel of his own free will or not. For a moment, the chef remained silent, clearly caught off guard by the question he had not anticipated at all. After a short pause, he lowered his head and proclaimed that, in the end, nothing could ever truly be hidden from him. He then began to recount how, in those times, he had been a prominent figure among the ghosts, but was attacked and seriously wounded. A few weeks from then, he was on the brink of losing his soul. He had no choice but to turn to the owner of the hotel. Turning back to the kettle over the fire, he began to stir the food, remarking that although he had healed over the years, this hostess was no ordinary woman. He entered into a contract with her, which is why he must stay there. And for him, there is no longer a vast world where he could savor delicacies and wines. Having heard him out, the young man asked if he would follow him through 2 worlds, should he give him a chance. The cook immediately froze in place with the spoon in his hands, not expecting that after everything that was heard, he would be asked that very question. After a while, he shook his head, saying that the mistress would not let him go anyway. The guy pulled out a contract and showed it to him as soon as he turned towards him. One of them contained his contract with the landlady, which had been annulled. The other sheet held a new contract with Lin Yue. The cook, looking on in shock, asked how he managed to do that at all. Ling Yu smiled and simply replied that he had money, that's all. With a single motion, he tore the contract apart, saying that perhaps he could promise him nothing more than freedom and safety. The cook, still in shock, remained silent, watching as pieces of the contract paper fell to the floor. Meanwhile, the guy continued to assure him that despite everything, there would be more than enough wine. The chef immediately folded his hands in a gesture of respect and exclaimed, "Well, if he's willing to spend that much on it, then he must like it." Snatching the contract from the young man's hands, the chef declared that he would go through fire and water for him. And it's not the wine and food that matter, but spending time with his brother. Having placed his seal there, the ghost handed the contract back to the hands of the gentleman standing there. As soon as the system offered him to open the attributes of the ghost that was now under his command, the young man immediately clicked yes. Looking at him, the guy thought about how his stats were hundreds of times superior to the guy's own, and his characteristics were very strong. In one way or another, the hotel of the afterlife appeared shabby, yet the threat of spirits was indeed terrifying. Had the quest not been bound by rules, and had he not mastered the system, they all would have perished long ago. Watching the chef stir the soup, the guy reflected on how, fortunately, this quest had revealed his hidden potential. The chef abruptly turned to him and dropped to one knee, declaring that from that moment onward he would follow only him. Leaning towards him, the guy asked him to stand up and not to be so formal, because from that moment on, he would be counting on him. Afterward, suggesting they sit together and share a drink, they began to sip the wine that the young man had brought. After some time, when they all gathered in the living room for dinner, the announcement came through the system that only 3 survivors remained. The guy thought that after he had signed the contract with the chef, the quest no longer posed any difficulty for him. Xiao Li and the bearded man also survived. However, that woman was torn to pieces when she encountered the guests while cleaning. In the end, it was a thrilling game where ghosts raged. Even with his system, money, and contracted spirits, there was no such thing as invincibility. Rising from his seat, he thought that according to the bearded uncle's words, the game opens every half-month. So one way or another, he must become stronger. He then stepped out onto the street as if he had no intention of waiting to return inside the hotel itself. Hearing Xiao Li call out to him, he immediately stopped and turned around, watching as she ran towards him. The girl ran up and thanked Lin Yu, saying that without him she wouldn't have survived her first day. He responded lightly, noting that by helping someone else you're also helping yourself, so there was nothing special about it. Xiao Li didn't respond, simply extending a piece of paper towards him with a request to take it. The guy took the piece of paper and looked at it with surprise, already guessing what was written on it. The girl explained that she was actually from Jiancheng and that her family had connections. So, if he ever needed help in reality, he could call this number. In the next moment, a bright blood-colored inscription appeared above their heads, congratulating the players on completing the quest. The guy was about to say something in response, but a message announced the quest was completed and promptly began to send them back, causing the ground beneath their feet to give way. And in that very instant, the young man found himself back in his apartment, holding the piece of paper without having had the chance to say anything. Looking at the piece of paper and the number written on it, he chuckled in perplexity, not understanding what to do with it. After placing it on the table, he decided to check the time. In the game, 2 days had passed, but according to the watch on his wrist, only a few seconds had gone by in reality. Frowning, Lin Yue activated his abilities and confidently called the chef to test their connection. Sitting closely with a wine bottle, he immediately responded and asked what was wanted of him. The young man replied that he needed nothing. He pondered it. The contract with the chef was stable in reality as well. The skull necklace and everything else also remained intact. It appeared that the Ghost Master was not only capable of bringing spirits along with him, but also weapons into reality. Approaching the window, he thought that the increasing number of gruesome incidents at the site in recent years seemed to be, for the most part, the work of ghost hunters with malicious intentions. Now he feared that the world was no longer a safe place, and the man said that from now on, they would be drawn into the game every 2 weeks. Shaking his head, he pushed away all those thoughts, deciding that he had too many secrets and that now was not the time for him to approach the administration. Deciding that it should serve as a forum, a conduit for information, the young man immediately changed the IP addresses, and only after that did I find the forum and finally managed to join it. Observing the articles, Lin Yu stated that the official announcements on the forum are nothing special. In the announcement from Investigation Center Number 9, the player rules were outlined. Upon reading them, a guy mentioned that there would be severe consequences for those who break the rules. It appeared that the presence of such an organization was instrumental in keeping the hunters in check, whose numbers were ever increasing. Deciding that he was a novice and that his main priority was self-protection, the young man opened the player's guide that was there. It was said that all terrifying quests exist in a place known as the World of Ghosts. This world of ghosts is vast and it is inhabited by countless spirits. However, ghosts could only kill according to specific rules. Ghosts are divided into 7 classes based on their strength, while humans have 9 ranks. Reading this information, the young man thought about how his Ghostmaster contract could ignore the difference in levels, allowing him to seize a fierce ghost for himself. Then, he said thoughtfully, looking at the forum, the game underwent internal testing only 5 times, yet there are already 100,000 players. Apart from the first group, which appears to have been destroyed, there were survivors from every other group. Some of them even had the opportunity to discover the soul-cleansing wine of hell in the realm of spirits and became rulers. He himself consumed the soul-cleansing wine, a couple of bottles, and exactly 3 bottles were required to completely subdue the chef. Without much thought, he found a marketplace where goods were being traded, and immediately realized that under the pressure of death, players inevitably feel the need to trade supplies, and the forum serves as such a marketplace. Suddenly, a new announcement from the forum's administration appeared on the screen, greatly surprising the guy. Having read it, the young man thought that the administration must want to organize a fair in Jiangchen. This is because online forum posts cannot satisfy the demand for trade. However, judging by the comments there, the guy could tell that the brothers were truly full of enthusiasm, and so he decided to register as well. After all, he too needed something. Immediately he did just that, selecting for himself the forum name Emperor Fendu. 3 days later, he had packed his suitcases and decided to check his belongings and balance, which is why he instructed the system to open the panel. Looking at everything that was written there, and considering he still had a whopping 9 trillion, the guy remarked that this is what it means to have wealth. Reflecting on the fact that today marked the first day of the fair, the young man grabbed his suitcase and made for the exit, declaring they were headed to Jiangchen. On Monday, he received a personal message in his email. On Thursday, he had already received his card and badge, which were lying in a locker at the shopping center. Now, at 1800 hours, he was traveling along the western ring road of Jiangchen with the poor Tajik. In the year 2000, they finally reached the abandoned factory in the Qingyuan district. As soon as the guy approached the line, he immediately noticed that there were a lot of people crowded at the entrance, so he quickly joined the queue. Looking at his card, he thought that anonymous meetings from the forum were truly challenging and secure. Even a mask could block out external spirits, not to mention everything else. Suddenly, a man called the boy over and told him that the ghost, which is controlled by Bai Ye, is one of the founders of 2 forums. The boy himself thought that it turns out the power of this yin energy is on the same level as that of evil spirits. As soon as the man and the boy approached, the monster told them that to enter the trading hall, they needed to wear name badges, and if they are to sell any goods or items, let them first have it appraised at an appraisal office. Glancing at one of the devices, Ling Yu commented that it appeared very modern. He expressed his curiosity about whether it could truly assess the quality of weapons and materials. Meanwhile, the man approached the guy and asked if it was indeed his first time there. He then said that this item, created by Research Center 9, is capable of classifying objects into categories based on their aura. Moreover, each category is divided into 3 classes. Having explained everything, he told not to worry because there would definitely be no deception involved. Lin Yu immediately thanked him for that. He pondered the fact that the technologies at their disposal and the strength of the earliest factions of players were terrifyingly powerful. He now understood clearly that he had not yet reached the point of arrogance and self-satisfaction. Therefore, he would hope that the fair would bring him many benefits. People stationed before that very machine were inspecting items brought to them by ordinary ghost hunters. Meanwhile, the man, upon hearing them tell one of the individuals who had brought a weapon that theirs was of a lower class, was greatly surprised. He explained that although it may be of a lower class, it could still be worth hundreds of thousands. Lin Yu immediately wondered how research of inferior quality could cost so much. He then feared that his weapon of average quality, the skull necklace of enmity, would simply be priceless. The next individual who approached them was told that they possessed Zhuanyin iron ore, a non-primary material for weapon crafting. Another one, with a necklace that has lost so much yin energy, now holds little value. The system immediately notified the young man that a damaged yin necklace had been detected. As he read this, he thought to himself that an expert's eye indeed possesses great strength, and his own findings aligned with the expert's evaluation. When it was their turn with the man, the guy immediately let him go ahead, thinking that there was no guarantee against encountering some strange and astonishing things. With words expressing that it was finally his turn, the man threw the item onto the evaluation table. With his eyes shut, he incessantly prayed inwardly for the item to be of average quality. However, as the assessment came to an end, and the device still had not determined the quality of the item, the man couldn't help but ask why this was the case. One of the experts, with a tone of surprise, commented that it seems to neither be a weapon nor a material, and the second one remarked that it was somehow odd, as if it contained a powerful yin energy. The third expert said that he couldn't determine its origin. Since they cannot provide an evaluation, the man is free to set the price himself. The man retrieved his item and with a sense of dejection walked away, expressing his surprise that even the experts couldn't handle it. Lin Yu patted him on the shoulder, encouraging him not to despair as he might encounter a buyer interested in it there. Observing the man's disheartened gaze upon the item, the boy also cast his eyes upon it. Following this, the system unexpectedly reported the detection of a higher quality yin energy emanating from the ominous pharaoh's band. While the guy looked after the man in shock, thinking he was of a higher caliber, one of the specialists asked what he wanted appraised. The young man seemed to come to his senses and reached for his bag, requesting the system to grant him a single wen coin. After placing it on the table, he thought that for the time being he would not make a show of himself and would use just one. The device immediately began to operate and checked the coin for the presence of energy. One of the individuals assessing it handed the coin back, commenting that it was made of quite ordinary material. He believed that if there were 100 of them, they would collectively be classified as lower third grade. The second reviewer halted the first, stating that things were not so simple. The yin energy was so pure that it contained no impurities, and he thought it was the currency of the Bank of Heaven and Earth, a currency that was used among ghosts. The third inspector took the coin from his hands and remarked that, moreover, the quality of this coin was even better than those he had seen in the quest. He mentioned that it said one of the laws of the spirit world is that people who possess the lesser coins there are simply nobodies. So if by any chance such a person wishes to engage in an exchange with a spirit, they would not succeed. But if people can obtain coins approved by the ghosts themselves, it would be tantamount to having the backing of a bank of both the ethereal and terrestrial realms, allowing them to trade with ease in the quest. Observing the young man, he thought to himself that ghosts do not easily let the currency flow into the hands of human hunters, so he fears that this young man is a skilled master. Emperor Fengdu is a name they had never heard before, suggesting he might be a newcomer, or perhaps a mysterious lone figure from the third faction. He confidently asked the boy aloud where he had gotten the coin from, as it was truly interesting. Lin Yu did not elaborate, but succinctly replied that this coin was a trophy. The appraiser, who initially mentioned it was merely metal, indicated that it turns out to be mithril, which is interesting. And then he offered to the guy that if he was interested, he could buy it for 1,500 won and become friends with him. Immediately, Lin Yu thought that if he were paid 1,500 wen per item, he could exchange the coins for 1.5 million, and that would be enough to make the down payment for a house in Liacheng. The second appraiser immediately stated that it was merely worth 1,500. He also confidently asserted that one must be aware that in trading with ghosts, it's not just the nominal value that matters, but rather the amount of yin energy and its integrity, after which he stated that the coin was brand new and intact, indicating that they, the forum, were willing to purchase it for 3,000 yuan. The guy pulled out a bag and said that under such circumstances it was good, but he questioned if they were truly sure they could afford such a luxury, because he had more to offer. One of the evaluators replied that he shouldn't be worried. After all, even if he pulls out 180 pieces, the forum will still be able to purchase them. Then he finally took off his bag from his shoulder and poured out a whole mountain of coins onto the table, all the while smiling at them. Everyone who was there had their jaws drop at the sheer quantity, and the appraiser who talked about making a purchase took out his phone, saying he needed to get in touch with someone. The second appraiser, in a state of panic, announced that the forum could not afford to spend so much money all at once. Therefore, he would charge $4,000 for each of the 20 items. The other people watched the unfolding scene with surprise, having a rough understanding of what was happening. They all immediately rushed towards the guy, offering their price for the quantity they were ready to buy. Observing all the commotion, the man who had been knocked down by the crowd remarked that he had not even managed to offer his thanks. Therefore, he hoped that Emperor Fendu would not bear any ill will towards him. The young man gazed at the crowd before him, pondering how, as one might expect from a system of wealth, it truly was a stroke of fortune achieved in an instant. However, despite appearances, this is not an auction where the victory goes to the highest bidder. Factors such as organization, queue, and the favor of the powerful play a crucial role and must be taken into account. Suddenly, a woman's voice was heard, instructing everyone to quiet down and calm down. The people who turned around saw a clearly high-ranking woman approaching them, heading straight for where the boys stood. All the evaluators standing behind the young man immediately rose, and to his surprise, they bowed in a respectful salute, announcing that she, Madame Bai, had arrived. The girl in the mask herself did not respond, continuing to walk towards them in silence, maintaining a cold indifference towards everything. Looking at her, the guy thought that she was one of the forum's founders, Bai Ye, who could command spirits to serve her. Therefore, he immediately nodded to her with ease, respectfully greeting her. However, the girl did not respond and walked past him to the table. Taking one, she said that these coins were of exceptional quality, and it was quite lavish of Emperor Fendu to use such fine items for an offline fair. Lin Yu responded that he did it only because he recently encountered some urgent matters and found himself slightly short of money. Placing a coin on the counter, the girl expressed her desire to purchase 1 guan from him for 7.5 million in cash. Additionally, on behalf of the forum, she wished to befriend him. People immediately started saying that Madame Bai wished to foster a friendship with Emperor Fengdu on behalf of the forum. Rumors abound that she has reached the peak of the 6th rank and is almost revered as a goddess in the kingdom of Jia. Someone mentioned that in the thriller, after the first 3 quests, the hunters can become friends and team up. And befriending Miss Bai is almost like having a protective talisman. Immediately, the young man pulled out the guqin, uttering, "Very good." And as expected of Lady Bai, she truly resembled a goddess. The girl did not respond. Instead, she summoned a frog from the lantern she was holding in her hands. Next to the girl, amidst the clouds of dust, a huge toad immediately appeared, which darted off with a suitcase of money. Without much hesitation, the frog immediately hurled Lin Yu's money case in his direction, following its owner's command. Gazing at her, Lin Yu thought that apparently this was a test for him. Thus, he too summoned the specter with whom he had a contract, and it instantly materialized behind him. While everyone watched the unfolding scene in shock, the ghost effortlessly caught and stopped the money case flying towards them. Then he knelt on one knee and respectfully bowed his head, opening the case with a request to check if everything was in order. After checking everything, the guy pulled out one key from the bunch and headed towards the girl, saying it was a good deal. She, in turn, didn't say anything, silently taking the money from his hands and continuing to stare intently at him. Throwing the bundle into the frog's mouth, she began to vanish, leaving words behind that she and Emperor Fendu will see each other again. After some time, she vanished completely, and people, shocked, began to discuss the event and the possibility that she had really left. However, at the next moment, as they declared the fair open, everyone's attention shifted away from that. In the hustle and bustle, everyone was trying to pick the best spot for their sales among all the tables and stands that had appeared there. One of the people approached Lin Yu and, rubbing his hands, asked if he still had those same coins. He waved him off and replied that, unfortunately, all the merchandise had already been sold out. And he had things to do, so he wouldn't be taking up any more of their time. Walking past places where people were selling their goods, the young man couldn't believe he had received 7.5 million in one go. Therefore, he could now take a moment to think and look around, considering what good things he might find to buy at the fair. Approaching a vendor, he glanced at the merchandise on offer when the system courteously informed him that the item was broken. Then the young man chose not to say anything and simply turned around and walked over to other vendors. Observing the other products, he reflected on how most of the goods there lacked certification and were essentially junk. Yet patience prevailed because the most crucial thing was to find what was needed. Upon hearing the system chirp with a notification that a weapon of medium quality had been found, the guy immediately turned around, his thoughts turning to the possibility that this weapon was of the same class as the Skull of Enmity necklace. Staring at the table where the black wooden cube sat, the guy tried to understand if that indeed was the weapon. Approaching the table, he took the cube from the hand and asked how much it was being sold for. The young man who recognized it immediately replied that he had found this item during a quest but had never understood its purpose. If the emperor wanted to buy it, he would sell it for 2,000 yuan. With the words that he was buying it, Lin Yu immediately handed over the money to the shocked guy who didn't expect this at all. The system immediately announced that the weapon had been automatically bound to its owner. In turn, the owner thought that now, their protection and attack were not tied to a single item. After purchasing all the fine weapons at the fair, he immediately headed to the very last table with a satisfied smile. To his fortune, there sat the man who wore the pharaoh's armlet, the very man who had been denied an appraisal of it. He immediately approached him, greeting him and calling him brother. In turn, the latter joyfully exclaimed that they had met again. Lin Yu immediately began to examine the goods, commenting that he actually had many fine items. The man awkwardly scratched his head and replied that it was merely a pile of cheap trinkets from the desert, and if they were of any interest he would sell them for a low price. Lin Yu picked up the bandage and remarked that it was the little item they hadn't been able to appreciate, then asked how much he would sell it for. The man crossed his arms over his chest and stated that he acknowledges the other's considerable wealth. However, he felt obliged to warn him that being unable to appreciate it isn't necessarily a good thing. The guy replied that there's nothing wrong with that and that money is meant to be spent, not saved. Then the man said that in that case he would simply give it to him for free without selling it. To the boy's surprise, he explained that it would be pointless to keep him, since even the experts couldn't help with his case. And perhaps he might be able to make use of it, not to mention that he is a strong person and that one is ready to befriend him. Lin Yu nodded and said that in such a case he also could not allow him to suffer. After that, he placed an entire guan of coins before the shocked man, who immediately asked why he was giving it to him. Wrapping a bandage around his arm, Lin Yu asked in return how one could quibble over a mere guan coin for such a power. Meanwhile, in the control room, one of the appraisers and a lady were watching the young man close the deal. The appraiser asked the girl why the Fendu Emperor buys undervalued items. She replied that she didn't know, but indeed this guy is quite interesting. Afterward, she pondered that judged by the standards of her spiritual consciousness, he was merely of the first grade. However, in response to her temptation, he unleashed a fierce ghost. She feared that the Emperor of Sundu could conceal his spiritual aura so effectively that even she was unable to perceive it. Reflecting on his ability to appraise objects as well, the girl commented that he is a very intriguing guy. Meanwhile, the fair went on and the young man reflected on how much he had managed to purchase. However, almost all of his earned money was also pretty much spent. So maybe it was a good idea to sell something. In the next moment, with surprise, he turned towards the crowd, which was clearly scolding someone there. Sitting at one of the tables, a man noted that he would pay a high price for an item that could be used to awaken spiritual consciousness. Among his requirements was the stipulation that it should have no side effects. People spoke of objects capable of awakening a person's spiritual consciousness as inherently valuable, and those without any side effects are even rarer. Upon hearing their words, the man stood up, impassioned, and declared that they, the John Chen Li group, were willing to pay the price. And if there truly were no side effects, he was prepared to offer $10 million. People immediately stated that $10 million was a fair price. This is the Li group, and they control half of Lazia's oceanic trade. The young man immediately became thoughtful. Xiaonan from the Li group sounded like a girl's name. However, Xiao Li also hadn't awakened her spiritual consciousness, and this seemed too much like more than just coincidence. Deciding that he had already drunk his fill and would leave the next 2 bottles for the chef, with the last one serving both their needs, the young man pulled out a bottle. Placing it on the table, he claimed to possess a bottle of spiritual wine, stating that drinking it could awaken one's spiritual consciousness. The man skeptically examined the bottle and asked if it was really all that simple. Lin Yu immediately responded grimly, stating that if he did not believe in it, then he might as well have nothing to do with him. In response, the man nodded and said that he trusts Emperor Fendu under any circumstances. He then took out and laid a check on the table, stating it was a check for $10 million, and he could issue it to Li's company at any time. The guy immediately took the check from him, not forgetting to thank him for such a successful deal. Meanwhile, at the Li mansion, Xiao Li was speaking out loud to herself, trying to understand why her father had not allowed her to go to the fair. Despite becoming a participant in the game, he was fated to not escape the cruelty of the world. And her brother Lin never called, leaving her unaware if he was at the fair. Suddenly, her father entered and with a smile announced that he had purchased something that could awaken her spiritual consciousness. After that, he pulled out and showed her the wine, and the girl immediately asked, "Isn't this the same wine that little brother Lin used to drink?" She thought to herself that brother Lin was willing to sell a treasure so captivating it even fascinated severe ghosts. As she stood there pondering, her father inquired about who Lin was. The girl did not respond, but simply opened the wine, mentioning that it was indeed Lin's brother's wine. Her father told her she needed to drink it quickly, and then she would have the spiritual consciousness required to survive the quest. After tilting the bottle and pouring its contents into her mouth, Xiao Li thought that indeed she could no longer rely on the protection of others. This is precisely why she decided that she needed to become stronger, and the next time she met brother Lin, she had to be of use to him. While reading an article about Xiao Li, the guy thought to himself that it was indeed her. Out loud, he remarked that even in the midst of an enthralling game, the super rich are just as vulnerable as ordinary people. However, even he, who relied on the pervasive Minbi system, could not treat this matter lightly. Despite ghosts being bound by rules over time, these restrictions become increasingly lenient as they settle into the ghostly realm. For instance, the hide-and-seek quests mentioned on the forum, where the only way for players to survive is to keep running away. Standing up, he said that perhaps one day there would be no place in the rules for good intermediaries, and they would have to fight. Without much thought, he called upon the system and mentioned that after 2 weeks of practicing meditation techniques from textbooks discussed in the forum, he was close to advancing to the 2nd level. Moreover, it seemed that with the increase in spiritual awareness, the system had begun to more accurately recognize the function and class of weapons. Among his arsenal were the skull necklace of enmity, the sinister Luhu cube, and the ominous pharaoh's headband. Observing the situation, the young man remarked that he possessed 2 weapons of medium quality, one for offense and the other for defense. Additionally, he had a weapon of superior quality. He now understood that his own combat capability was finally taking shape. Some time had passed when midnight once again arrived on the day the quest began, and in the air before the boy, a bloody inscription appeared anew, declaring that this time the name of the given quest was Otherworldly Boarding House. Beneath the boy's feet, the floor immediately began to give way, transporting him directly into the quest. However, this time he didn't panic and simply stated that in that case he was ready. After a while, the boy's eyes widened as he read that at the moment only 3 survivors remained in the quest. Having risen from the bed where he had been lying, the young man looked around and stated that it seemed he had already moved. After that, he turned to the wall where something appeared to be affixed. From what he could tell, these were presumably the rules and conditions of the quest. Firstly, the card was the resident's sole possession, and if it was lost, no replacement was issued. Secondly, the boarding house maintained a no-noise policy throughout the day. Thirdly, the area surrounding the ethereal boarding house was not safe or peaceful. For these reasons, the residents were advised to be cautious when opening the door to visitors and to try not to open the windows. Fourthly, entering the private rooms was forbidden. Fifthly, the boarding house supervisor would carry out regular checks, so littering was not allowed. And finally, the curfew was at 11 p.m., and one needed to keep track of the time. As the guy read through all these rules, he thought to himself that they seemed like rules for killing, characteristic of the multitude of ghosts in the quest. One way or another, he understood that the purpose of the task was not something for him to worry about, because if he had simply paid the fee for the rental, he could have stayed there and calmly waited for it to end. Swiping his card to exit, the guy thought that it wasn't an option for him. After all, if in every quest the aim is merely to survive, sooner or later one might spiral downwards, as the adversary becomes stronger and stronger. Therefore, he decided that he must seize every opportunity to increase his strength. Stepping into the corridor, the young man was greatly surprised to find so many rooms there. It wouldn't have surprised him so much if he hadn't known that at the entrance it was stated that only 3 had survived. Observing all these rooms that spanned entire floors, Ling Yu remarked that, in other words, the compact, hive-like rooms in this tall building might be inhabited by ghosts. Proceeding further down the corridor, the young man stumbled upon a poster hanging on the wall, which immediately caught his attention. It appeared to be a layout of an otherworldly boarding house. There was a revolving restaurant on the 30th floor. Floors 26 to 29 were designated as private areas, while floors 5 through 25 contained all the living quarters. Reading through all this information, Lin Yu said that this time the map is much larger than that of the Netherworld Hotel, and he doesn't even know by how much. Without much thought, he announced that he would go to the real estate center to see what was happening there, and then headed towards the elevator. However, as soon as the elevator arrived at the desired floor, the guy was surprised to notice a large number of fingerprints and bloodstains inside it. Frowning at them, he said he was afraid that the average person wouldn't dare to take an elevator ride. However, deciding that in any case he could always cover his back, Lin Yu still went in. However, as soon as the young man was about to press the button for the desired floor, a creepy voice behind him asked him to pay for the use of the elevator. Lin Yu immediately turned in that direction and saw before him a terrifying creature with enormous teeth, a type of ghost he had never encountered before. For a while he remained silent, and then, without stopping his smile, he asked how much he needed to pay for the use of the elevator. The ghost responded that the price for one person was 1 yuan. If he could not pay, then it could take his flesh and blood or his soul to settle the debt. An awkward pause hung in the air. The guy couldn't believe everything was so cheap, to the point where it almost felt embarrassing. Without much thought, he instructed the system to cash out 101 wen coins. Tossing aside one ghost, the guy ordered it to immediately take him to the 3rd floor. The ghost caught the flying money with its teeth, attempting to discern where this frail human being had managed to find the money. One way or another, although it was his rule for murder, it was evident from his face that he wanted to pull something off. The ghost immediately spoke up and said that he was simply given cash, which doesn't count. Since this elevator is part of the ethereal pension and only supports purchases made with a credit card, and if he's not a club member, he could use his room card instead. He thought to himself that the newcomers had surely not yet taken the time to replenish their supplies, and he would never let him go without drawing blood. The guy didn't waste words. Instead, he simply raised his hand, indicating that he had given him a chance, which was not taken. The ghost immediately cried out that he was giving a warning. Direct use of minbi constitutes a serious crime, and if he willingly surrenders his hand, then he might consider not pursuing him legally. However, Lin Yu did not respond to this and, frowning, snapped his fingers. Behind him, a chef immediately appeared, who began to complain that it was very cramped there. Without hesitation, the chef immediately struck the ghost in the eye with force, causing it to retreat further back and press against the wall. Then, approaching him, I fiercely looked into his eyes, called him a scoundrel, and asked if someone like him truly needed his master's hand. The ghost immediately asked, with tears in its eyes, if it truly was the fierce ghost and what it was even doing there. In the next moment, the monster suddenly spat something towards the newly appeared ghost. He immediately caught something and showed it to the guy. It turned out to be a 1 wen silver coin, which he had evidently given in exchange for the spoiled one. After saying that, he noted he was just joking and that he neither needed help nor money. From now on, the guy could ride the elevator without having to pay for it. With a smirk, Lin Yu flicked a coin between his fingers while looking at him and commented that he truly had a knack for making jokes. As if heeding his command, the cook immediately lunged at the ghost before him, and with his sword gouged out one of its eyes. Then he turned back to the guy and said that he was one with the elevator, and if they cut him off, the elevator, it seems, would come to a halt. In turn, he said that in such a case, they would spare his life. Instantly, the monster thanked him and referred to him as a VIP guest. After that, the young man tossed a coin into the mouth of the surprised monster, who did not see it coming at all, and he commanded to truthfully answer the question posed to him about the nature of the otherworldly membership. The ghost mentioned that these are the most privileged residents of the apartments, symbols of high status, and they have access to the most exclusive places, with even the rules being unfettered for them. Lin Yu asked how this was possible without obstruction, and the ghost replied that it seems the members are subject to special membership rules. These are established individually by the council members. Then, after some thought, the young man asked how he could join the otherworldly membership. The ghost responded that he was merely a low-level spirit, capable only of maneuvering within the elevator shaft and listening to the passengers' chatter. Lin Yu found himself pondering once again. It appeared that within this quest of the otherworldly boarding house, obtaining membership was indeed a significant accomplishment. Therefore, he needed to find a way to get in there as soon as possible. After a while, the elevator finally came to a halt, and without delay, the ghost announced its arrival on the 3rd floor. Stepping out of the elevator, the young man decided to keep the ghost behind him hidden, so he told Zhu Jian to disappear, which he immediately did. Having examined everything there, he stated that there were only 4 areas, and all of them were empty and spacious. Among them was the payment department, which housed the cash desks and was staffed by not too many employees. There was also an information department and a real estate center, which likewise could not boast a large number of employees. The complaint department, on the other hand, looked as though it had been long abandoned and forgotten. Looking at him, the guy stated that he couldn't believe there was actually a complaints department. And was it truly for complaints about ghosts? After thinking it would be interesting to check out the information department, the guy decided that he first needed to pay his bills and also deposit some money onto his card. Upon entering, Ling Yu immediately noticed the absence of clients. The place was utterly deserted, with only the staff present. Looking at them, he thought they were first-level ghosts, weaker than the accountant Lee from the otherworldly hotel. However, the infrastructure of the otherworldly boarding house is simply too immense, and on the upper floors there ought to be superior spirits, while all these others are no more than mere gnats. Placing the card in front of the employee, he called him over and said that he would like to pay for the room he was staying in. The ghost, with an evident distaste, took his card and, glancing at the number, pronounced it aloud, after which he mentioned that he would need to pay a total of 2,500 yuan for the room, utilities, and also for food, beverages, and accommodation, all of which should be charged to the card. The guy pondered. After all, the prices there must have been much higher than in the hotel of the afterlife. Meanwhile, the ghost turned to him with a mocking smile and remarked that no less than 500 yuan had to have been deposited as a down payment by today, and the full amount should be paid within 3 days. Otherwise, they would resort to other means to collect the debt. Lin Yu asked if he was truly talking about them taking flesh, blood, and soul. The ghost was surprised by this and by the fact that it didn't scare him. Tossing a card in his direction, the ghost replied, "Of course," adding that he had recently moved in and couldn't afford his services. Thus, he recommended visiting the information center to find a job. Watching him, the young man remained motionless, contemplating that it appears one of the functions of the information department is to disseminate information about the work. The ghost, in turn, loudly inquired if he was deaf and suggested that if he was not seeking employment, it implied he wished to die. The guy attempted to explain something, but the ghost cut him off, declaring that the otherworldly boarding house does not welcome the lazy, and ordered him to scram. In turn, he didn't go anywhere but simply sighed wearily, thinking that it seemed if he didn't demonstrate his strength, they would all continue to waste his time needlessly. After setting up a sign that VIP clients are served first, the guy asked if yelling at customers who are paying their bills is their idea of service. The ghost replied that, as far as he could see, this was for VIP clients. But he was merely a new resident in the general district and didn't have a penny to his name on the card. The guy immediately tossed aside the sign that said it's not without reason people say dealing with offspring is tough. Their spiritual consciousness is too frail, and they lack vision altogether. Placing the money on the table, the guy asked him who said he couldn't pay his bills. The jaw of the ghost who saw such an amount of money instantly dropped. Clearly, this was beyond his expectations. The other ghosts working there immediately began discussing the money and the purity of the yin energy contained therein. Lin Yu stated that there were 100,000 yuan and asked for them to be saved for him. Later, he expressed curiosity about whether he was now considered a VIP client or not. Taking the money, the ghost said in a frightened tone that of course one could transfer it to a card, since after all he was a VIP guest. As he counted them, he kept saying that his mind possessed the pure energy of yin and he would stake 100,000 on his balance. He then handed the map over to the guy, asking him to take it. Upon taking it, the guy immediately inspected it, noticing that the balance was displayed directly on the card, which explained why this guy was such a snob. Without much thought, he turned to leave, but just then, the monster behind the cash register asked if he was going to complain about him. Without turning towards him, the guy waved his hand and said that he didn't have time to waste on him. Immediately, the ghost began to bow, expressing words of gratitude and promising never to forget the kindness shown to him. Stepping into the corridor, the young man began to ponder what to do next. After all, the replenishment was complete and the task accomplished. But he was certain that the other two players were out there somewhere, and he was curious about who they were. Suddenly, beyond the grove in front of which the boy stood, hurried footsteps were heard. He immediately glanced at the staircase, thinking that they had, of course, chosen the stairs, and if it weren't for the cook, he would not have opted for the elevator. In the next instant, the door flew open and a man hurried out, one of his hands completely purple and with strange eyes. Watching her, the guy thought fearfully that one could go mad because she was a fourth-rank guard. The man turned towards the guy and asked if he was truly a first-rank hunter and if the floor was safe in that case. The guy responded that the floor was safe, and the man immediately sheathed his knife, saying that was just great. Then, stretching out, he retrieved a small pouch from beneath his cloak, under the intense gaze of the eye on his hand. Then, with the words, "Hold this," he extended a piece of meat which he had pulled out from there into the mouth of the monster, which immediately devoured it. Watching the monster vanish and a man's hand reappear in its place, the boy thought that fresh blood and flesh must be the price for the contract he made with the maimed ghost. Meanwhile, the man asked how he had descended so quickly and whether he had actually taken the elevator. When asked if it was dangerous, the guy replied that there's a malicious ghost in the elevator who demands a single M&M. But even if you give it to him, he'll find a reason to pick a fight, although he's not much of a fighter. In response to the young man's counter-question about whether he had seen anyone descending the staircase, the man replied that there was no surveillance. According to the accounts of spirits that pass through there, it is an unofficial realm of the afterlife boarding house, which was occupied by 6 aggrieved ghosts and 1 evil one. They asked the man for money to buy cigarettes, and on some of the steps of the staircase, traps were set, making it very difficult to deal with. Having walked a bit further, the man looked up and remarked that it seemed in this inner boarding house to have all paths open, keys were necessary. Pointing ahead, the guy confirmed it was true. He had been at the payment center. Indeed, to avoid a fine, one must deposit no less than 500 yen onto the card and within 3 days pay a total of 2,500. After totaling 500 for today and 2,500 overall, the man exhaled with relief and happily announced that he could afford it. Looking at him, the young man pondered. Indeed, looking at offline fares, it's challenging for gamers to earn minbi, and this person is a 4th-rank hunter. He suggested aloud to the man that since he had already finished restocking, he could accompany him, and then they could explore the floor together. The man responded without any issue, and Lin Yu thought that he considered him a 1st-rank novice. Nonetheless, Lin Yu felt he still had ample room to showcase his skills. Upon entering the accounting office, the man immediately placed his card on the table and stated that he wanted to pay his contribution. The ghost behind the counter turned and haughtily said something to the man. Suddenly he caught sight of a somber youth behind him, and startled, he began to mutter something in a frightened manner. The young man himself continued to gaze at him grimly as though he had already committed some offense. Looking at him, the ghost could only ask with a frightened tone how much backup was coming, deciding not to risk its health and integrity. Rummaging through his bag, the man stated that although the room rate is 2,500, there are likely other living expenses to consider. He then pulled out the coins, declaring that there would be a top-up of 2,700, oblivious to the unamused expression of the guy behind him. The ghost grabbed the coins and, with a frightened exclamation, declared that these coins were also imbued with pure energy, and without error there were 2,700 of them. Placing them on the map, the ghost respectfully extended it back, asking for it to be taken. The man turned to Lin Yu and said that if he still didn't have enough money for the rent, he could lend him some in advance. He then shared how it came to be that he encountered a high-ranking hunter with whom he immediately got along. The hunter insisted on giving him a guan, whose currency is so valuable that one is worth 10 yuan. Wrapping an arm around the man's shoulder, they walked together towards the exit, inquiring about his name. After all, despite being merely a 1st-rank hunter, he had managed to descend in the elevator. This convinced the man that he too possessed boundless potential. Listening to him share that he was Quan Dao, the boy thought that he couldn't reveal to him that his name was Emperor Fendu. So instead, he simply said his name was Fendu. The man immediately exclaimed that it was a cool name and, gesturing ahead, suggested they should finally get going. The guy agreed. After that, they both entered the information center room, which also had no clients. Walking past the stand, the guy read what was written there. It appeared to be a board for sale and lost and found notices in this hostel. Before them on a chair sat a gaunt specter, clearly an employee there, but currently asleep. paying them no attention whatsoever. The guy said that of course if there isn't enough money, then he will have to sell things or work for money. The man said that part-time work in these stores would definitely require additional rules and would mean more danger for the players. The young man replied that fortunately none of them would have to work for half wages anymore. The man turned towards him and looked at him in shock, wondering if Fendu, a first-class hunter, truly had enough money. Walking to the elevator, he loudly suggested going down to the first floor. After all, their game didn't include any regular food, so they would still need to eat and drink whatever was available there. After calling the elevator, the guy immediately agreed with him and suggested that they take a ride in the elevator. Upon hearing his words, the man flinched in fear and, awkwardly scratching his head, said that it was all well and good, but his coins were of large denomination, and he wondered if the boy was certain that the ghost would be able to give change. The guy didn't say anything, and as soon as the elevator arrived, he stepped in, reminding the ghost about the promise not to charge him for the ride and asking if it was okay to bring a friend along. The man was so taken aback by all this that his jaw simply dropped. The ghost remained silent, and after a brief moment, the man also stepped into the elevator, casting a brooding glance at the frightened ghost from the corner of his eye. At the same time, he thought that Fendu was not as simple as he seemed, and the aggrieved ghost in the elevator was not considered weak, but was still so submissive before him. Turning to look at the young man, he thought that little brother Fendu either had a very powerful aggrieved ghost, was armed with yin weapons, or had simply concealed his strength. After a while, the elevator finally arrived at the first floor and both people immediately exited it, encountering a large number of small and not-so-small ghosts in the common hallway. As they walked by them, they turned toward them and laughed loudly and maliciously. The boy thought they were all the angry and aggrieved spirits, but they shouldn't break the rules unless provoked. In their search for the shop, the two of them walked past a laundry, a food court, and a supermarket, all of which, the guy noted, took up a third of the floor. Glancing to the side, the young man asked if there really was no door to the outside world on the ground floor. The man concluded that leaving the boarding house was not possible. He suggested going to the supermarket first. Lin Yu immediately agreed, thinking that he truly wasn't in a position to ponder too much about it at the moment. Without much hesitation, they both made their way towards the supermarket there and went inside. The ghost behind the counter immediately greeted them without much enthusiasm. The people did not respond, and Lin Yu frowned, covering his nose from the offensive odor of rot that assaulted his senses. Approaching the man who picked up a moldy bun, the young man stated that the item was priced at 15 yuan. The man sighed and responded that there was nothing to be done about it. After all, one cannot survive without food. Upon seeing the water being sold there, the young man immediately grimaced while the man asked in surprise, "What kind of water is this exactly?" As soon as they found the toilet paper, the man picked it up, saying with certainty that they would definitely need it, causing the guy to burst out laughing. Having gathered enough purchases and making his way to the checkout, the man turned to the young man and inquired if he really wasn't going to buy anything yet. The latter responded that he would look around some more since he wasn't in a hurry yet. Handing his card to the cashier who had told him the total for his purchases, the man thought it was correct. After all, even a first-rank hunter would struggle to scrape together 2,500 manbi, and he probably didn't have any money left for food and drinks. Having grabbed his bag of groceries, he turned to Lin Yu and said that in such a case, he would come back to pick up his belongings. When asked about his plans, the young man responded that for the time being he would stay and look around there. The man thought to himself that he was likely going to make money for food, and that, alas, is the pride of youth. Just as he was leaving the store, he put an arm around the guy's shoulders and mentioned that he was staying in room 1111, inviting him to come over if he needed anything. Watching him enter the elevator and wave at him, saying to make sure he comes over, the young man thought perplexedly that he had already made up some plan in his head. And so, making his way to the elevators, he called one with the declaration that, if that's the case, he might as well visit the upscale store on the first floor. The ghost that was there immediately referred to him as a VIP guest and asked which floor he wanted to go to. Lin Yu thought this was probably because the ghost of the elevator had told him about him. However, he confidently said aloud that he needed to go to the second floor. The ghost immediately obeyed. The elevator swiftly transported him to his destination, and within a few seconds, the young man stepped out on the second floor. Judging by what he saw, there were fewer ghosts there than on the other floors, and they looked quite respectable and even well off. Walking towards the store, the guy marveled at its immense size, and with admiration he exclaimed aloud that it was quite impressive. At the entrance, he was halted by one of the ghosts who, smirking mockingly, informed him that the store operates on a membership basis and does not serve ordinary residents. A guy asked how much the membership costs. The girl responded that there is no membership fee, and he automatically becomes a member of the store once the balance on his card reaches a certain amount. Then he pulled out a card and extended it to her, asking if she would check whether there was enough money on it. The phantom glanced at his card and even started to mock him playfully, noticing that his balance was insufficient. However, she immediately fell silent in horror and began to count the balance figures on his card with even greater terror. Hearing the words that he was already a member of the store, the ghost, in a panic, invited him inside. While passing by the shelves of products, Lin Yi commented that compared to these items, the ones bought by Brother Quan Dao could only be thrown away. Taking the meat from the leg of a malevolent spectral beast, he mentioned that if this were given to Zhu Jian, it could be used to prepare spectral cuisine that would rival the previous dish made from a ghost. Therefore, without much thought, he tossed it into the basket, declaring, "I'll take it." He then glanced at the system window with the task and immediately thought that very few people could spend a huge amount there. Hence, he couldn't afford to be cheap. Swiftly moving through various departments, he gathered goods and products from there, all the while choosing the most expensive ones available. The ghosts spectating him noticed that he chose the most expensive items in the category and observed how young he was, deducing that he must come from a wealthy family. Meanwhile, the young man was selecting alcoholic drinks, choosing 2 bottles of beverages priced at 15,000 and 8,000 specifically for the chef. Ultimately, after making the purchase, it all cost him just 56,000. But in the end, he realized that even the supermarket has its limits. Suddenly, another ghost arrived and, after respectfully greeting the young man, announced that he was the manager of the elite store. The guy asked what happened, to which he replied that he was flattered by his patronage and, in return, wanted to make him a small gift. Upon opening the box that was brought in by other ghosts, the manager mentioned that it was a gift box with dishes from the revolving restaurant on the 30th floor, and he thought it would be useful for all the ingredients he had purchased. Immediately, the system declared it to be a mid-tier second-category weapon, yet the young man couldn't help but think to himself that he simply couldn't believe it. Out loud, he stated his desire and summoned the cook, who promptly appeared behind him. Taking the knife, the ghost contentedly said that the knife would come in handy for him, and it was a fine thing. Immediately thereafter, he vanished under the shocked gaze of the store manager, who was horrified by the aura. Deciding to lighten the mood, the manager pointed to a basket and asked the young man if he would like those items delivered to his room. He responded positively immediately, while the manager began to scold the staff, asking them to slow down the basket transportation to avoid damaging the VIP's belongings. All this time, Lin Yu hadn't taken his eyes off the manager, and finally, he asked what he needed to do if he wanted to become a member of another world and join the council of that other world. The manager's jaw dropped in astonishment at his question, and he asked in shock if he truly wished to become a member of another world and council. The guy responded that of course it was the case, and who wouldn't want to enjoy the privileges available to them. To himself, he thought that to complete the system quest, he needed to move into a league for higher expenditures, so it was time to act. The manager, with a hint of fear in his voice, admitted that he was unsure how to become a member of the board. However, he had heard a little about how to become a member of another world. Hearing his words about how this time the conditions are much harder than just being a member of their shop, the guy told him to go on because he's all ears. Immediately, the manager mentioned that, as far as he is aware, there are 3 ways to become a member of another world. Regardless of which method is chosen, a membership fee of 150,000 yuan must be paid. Lin Yu smiled and said that he thinks he understands that it has never been a problem for him. Meanwhile, the manager continued to say that the first option is chosen by the majority of members, and it represents a contribution to the public affairs of another world. This must be someone who has worked conscientiously for many years in the otherworldly boarding house, consistently achieving outstanding results, or the one who put an end to a series of vile incidents that had harmed the interests of the boarding house. Additionally, if he desires to share something highly beneficial and constructive, he may be accepted as a member of the club. After hearing him out, the young man became pensive. Regardless, he had to leave the quest in 3 days, and there was too little time for that. Meanwhile, the manager once again caught his attention and said that the second method was a referendum among the residents. Upon submission of the membership application, the real estate center will conduct a referendum among all residents and business owners to decide whether the applicant can become a member of another world. If more than half agree, then the applicant will be granted membership. When the guy asked about the third one, the manager mentioned he had only heard about him. It is said that if more than 10 members from another world or a member of the council collectively invite him, he could become a full-fledged member of the other world. The guy thought offering a bribe to the folks from the third route was much easier than holding a referendum, and the task was simply to reach out to the other members. Handing over the money to the surprised manager, the young man thanked him for the answers, to which he replied that it was his job. Wishing him a pleasant stay, he assured that he would send someone to his room immediately. Already seated in the elevator, the young man tried to figure out if this time money could solve everything. But in any case, for him, trying was no hardship. The elevator arrived at the third floor, and no sooner had the young man stepped out than he found himself bumping into two other people right at the entrance. Gazing at the guy with the ridiculous haircut, Lin Yu thought he must be the other player he'd been told about. However, judging by what he saw and his spiritual awareness, he hadn't even reached a fifth of a first-rank hunter's strength, and he feared that surviving on his own would be difficult. Embracing the young lad by his shoulders, the man called over Lin Yu and asked how it came to be that he, too, ended up there. He replied that he had entered the store for information and was now heading to the real estate center to check everything. The man immediately began to ponder. Did he really want to apply for a job at the real estate center? But still, he decided not to ask too many questions, and so he changed the subject, mentioning that he had met this little guy on the 11th floor, and he had played the game only twice, so he didn't even become a hunter. Thinking that Quan Dao wouldn't believe he was a beginner too, the guy boldly asked aloud if he was only being taken along to cover the bill. The man replied that he was currently broke and that he intended to take him to an employment center so he could find a job. Observing how they stood there, embraced, the boy thought it seemed like Quan Dao was indeed planning to assist him. However, if he continued to merely hide behind others, next time his end would be far more tragic. Out loud he wished them luck, and, turning, he went on his way to attend to his own affairs. He understood that he also needed to seize the opportunity to fully utilize his abilities through this quest. Upon entering the real estate center, the young man immediately began to silently inspect the premises, where no one even paid him any attention. Besides an old woman who, from the very beginning, the young man understood to be a stern ghost. At that moment, an elderly lady approached the young man and informed him that she was the duty officer of the real estate center of the otherworldly boarding house. She then asked how she could assist him. The guy walked past her and sat down on the couch, crossing one leg over the other. Then he mentioned that he would like to apply for membership at the otherworldly boarding house. The old woman immediately turned around in fright and sat down opposite him, saying that he should wait while she checked his contribution, or he could present a letter of recommendation. However, the young man replied that he did not need such methods. Afterward, he called upon the system and asked it to give him 150,000. But then changed his mind and requested 15 bills, each with a denomination of 100,000 RMB. Without looking at the offered money, the old woman stated that, unfortunately, he must fulfill other conditions before he could pay the entrance fee. And it was just a slim stack of cash. In the next moment, the guy tossed the bills into the air, and they began to whirl around under the shocked gazes of the staff. The old woman looked at them in shock, unable to comprehend how the banknotes could suddenly burst with such yin energy. Then, intently listening, she asked, "Could their denomination possibly be 100,000? The guy confirmed that this was indeed the case, stating that there were a total of 1.5 million yuaknis, which is 10 times more than the membership fee. He then directed the bills towards the woman, who was so shocked she couldn't say a word. But as soon as the bills flew toward her, she immediately began catching them, saying that it was her fault, and asking for his forgiveness for what she had said. As soon as the young man mentioned his intention to make a donation, the old woman's jaw dropped in astonishment. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly, but what he was saying seemed beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, Lin Yu, continuing to sit on the sofa, asked if he could still become a club member with such a membership fee. After listening to the boy, the old woman immediately sprang up and declared that she would ask the head of the council right away. After she called, she mentioned that they had a new resident who was interested in becoming a member. This individual wasn't a regular user, but rather a newcomer who proposed to contribute 1.5 million as their membership fee. Upon hearing the response on the phone, she shouted, certain that every bill has a denomination of 100,000. After finishing her speech, the elderly woman approached the young man and told him that a council member would later meet with him personally to assist with his transition to membership in another realm. Looking at her, the guy remembered reading on a forum that the denomination of the renminbi is determined by the content of yin, and that a 100,000 yuan bill signifies that they are harder to produce and are released in smaller quantities. And he is confident that the people at the boarding house agreed so readily, and even the leader will come in person. Thus, the process turned out to be easier than expected. Suddenly, the door swung open, and in came a tall ghost, completely shrouded in clothing. Immediately, the elderly woman bowed to him, addressing him as Sir, while the ghost paid her no attention, instead asking the young man if he truly wished to become a member of another world. The young man looked at him, then smiled lightly and responded loudly with a yes. In the next moment, the elderly woman approached the senior ghost and handed him the money, asking him to take a look. The sight of it made the ghost's jaw drop in astonishment, for they were indeed $100,000 bills. Sitting opposite the boy, the ghost asked if he could inquire what he intended to do upon arriving at the boarding house after spending a fortune. Lin Yu responded that since it is a boarding house, naturally he would stay there, and since he has the money, of course, he wants the very best. Then he gestured towards the money and asked if his donation was finally enough. The ghost tucked the money into his bosom and replied that he was the first to make a contribution in the form of a donation. After seeing the notifications that appeared from the system, the guy thought with a smile that, fortunately, it really counted towards the assignment. After exhaling, he glanced at the ghosts and said that in that case, the others truly cannot derive any pleasure. The ghosts immediately wondered if, in his opinion, the power of 1.5 million was accessible to everyone, and in all their years of work there, they had never seen such a rough-hewn guy. The ghost extended the card and requested permission to speak about the privileges of upgrading membership status. This card was his exclusive membership and identification card. At the same time, he will be getting a new room on the 16th floor. There will no longer be a curfew and hygiene restrictions. However, it is still important to be cautious, avoid making noise, and not to open doors without permission, as well as to refrain from entering others' rooms. The ghost also mentioned that it resides on the 27th floor where the Pensions Board of Governors is located. On the 28th floor, there is a trading area for goods, accessible exclusively to club members. On the 29th floor lies the club's activity center where one can indulge in gambling and other entertainments, and even some special services. The revolving restaurant will also offer him priority reserved seating, as well as access to the top floor's private rooms and special deals. Upon hearing the young man say that it was just great, the ghost asked if he had any more questions. The guy thought for a moment and then replied that he had one more question. He then stated that, since he had purchased a membership for $1.5 million, whether he was selling his position as a representative of the Council of Another World. Both ghosts who were listening to him opened their mouths in shock, not expecting him to ask something like that with such an unflappable demeanor. Leaping from his seat, the ghost proclaimed that a council member's position is naturally not for sale, and no matter how much money is offered, it remains not for sale. Afterward, he began to pace back and forth, stating that in the afterlife boarding house there are hundreds of members, but only 13 representatives, and to become a member of the council, one must undergo a series of trials. The guy asked if he could contribute during the trials, seeing as how things were turning out. Looking at the money in his hands, the ghost froze in fear and coughed. Afterward, he mentioned that if this matter was indeed of such importance to him, he would get in touch with him tomorrow, following discussions with the other council members. The young man rose from his seat and with a smile thought it was actually quite excellent to reach such heights solely through the use of money. He then approached the ghost and extended his hand, saying that in such a case he would eagerly await news from him. Without much thought, the ghost extended its hand and shook his without saying anything in response to his words. As soon as the boy left, the ghost lowered itself onto the couch again and, with a weary sigh, remarked that he was finally gone. The elderly woman, calling him by the 13th name in her fright, asked what in the devil's name the boy was. Shaking his head, he responded that he wasn't sure. The scent seemed human, that of a so-called player. Despite this, no one can possess 1.5 million minbi, let alone denominations of 100,000. Moreover, the ability to produce coins of such denomination implies significant control over yin energy. Thus, he is certainly no ordinary person. His human side cannot emerge by mere chance, and the world of spirits should hold no value for him whatsoever. While in the elevator, the ghost pondered whether this was only because he hadn't attended their otherworldly meeting. But they didn't know if it was flattery or probing. This was something he truly needed to discuss with the other council members. Meanwhile, Lin Yu was already walking down the corridor towards his room, outside of which sat a box of groceries. Looking at her, he sighed tiredly and said that had he known it would be necessary to change the number, he wouldn't have allowed them to deliver the purchases to the 12th floor. As he spoke about what still needed to be done, ghosts sped past him with such tremendous speed that he didn't even notice. All three of them stopped near his box of purchases and began to inspect it with malicious laughter. Observing them, Lin Yu thought that perhaps these were the staircase ghosts that Quan Dao had mentioned. However, it was unclear. One of the ghosts said she'd already told me that the salesman had delivered everything to the 12th floor. The other ghosts started discussing how a poor guy living on the 12th floor could afford all these things, and what idiot managed to accumulate a fortune, and maybe he wanted a promotion. Ghost muttered that since he hadn't returned yet, they'd just steal them. And anyway, there was nothing in the rules against stealing. And what's more, if they take them, they'll go through the boss in the stairwell. And if the guy dares to go after them, he'll only regret it even more. Looking at them, the guy shook his head. As it turned out, they were just a few greedy brats. Going out to them, he got their attention and loudly asked what they were doing there and why they were outside his room. One of the ghosts said that what they were doing was none of his business, so let him fuck off. Lin Yu asked if it was none of his business. After all, they were targeting his belongings standing there. The ghosts immediately looked at him in shock, asking if he was the occupant of room 1206 and a first-rank hunter. The ghost girl quickly came to her senses and said that he had just said the things were his after all, and he could say they were his too. The other ghosts readily agreed with her and said that this was exactly what they could do, and now it was theirs. Looking at the way they were having fun and mocking him, the guy thought that if there was security there, they would never dare to do that. Meanwhile, the ghosts grabbed the box and with a loud cry of roll, rushed down the hallway toward the stairwell. Lin Yu mockingly hummed and leisurely headed down the corridor after the ghosts who had stolen the box from him. When he reached the stairwell, he closed the doors as soon as he stepped out of the stairwell, attracting the attention of the ghosts who already thought they had their prey. One of the ghosts cried out fearfully. Had the guy been following them all this time? And the knife-wielding ghost said that he's a little arrogant for willingly going up the stairwell. And doesn't he know it's their territory? A mortified Lin Yu strode forward with the words that whether or not this was their territory was a moot point. However, he also needed a place without surveillance. After all, then the hassle he'd be going through would be too much. Pointing to the knife, the guy asked, without much interest, what she was going to do with the knife, and whether she was going to slice his fruit. The ghost immediately told him to lay down and said that when she chopped his soul to pieces, he wouldn't think like that. The guy didn't answer anything but snapped his fingers and summoned a ghost that immediately appeared behind his back. All three ghosts lost their pompousness in an instant and now looked at him fearfully. The cook, meanwhile, took out a knife and filled it with spiritual energy with the words that a knife that could cut souls looked like this. The ghost holding the knife immediately dropped it to the ground and bounced back. After which, under the surprised looks of the other ghosts, she rushed to run downstairs, asking the boss to save her. The cook didn't look at it for long, and with a forceful flick of his knife at her, this knife hit the target, immediately piercing the ghost through and thus pinning it to the floor. The other two ghosts decided that this was their chance and rushed downstairs as well, saying that they needed to get out of here faster. However, Lin Yu activated his artifacts and suggested that he try something. Immediately, he threw the pharaoh's armband, which he had on his arm, in the direction of the fleeing men. Before they even realized what had happened, they were bound and knocked down by her. Looking at the guy, they said he should let them go because their boss wouldn't let him get away with it. Lin Yu didn't reply anything, and looking at them trying to get out, he only mockingly hummed. Afterward, with a still grim face, he asked the cook how he liked his new kitchen knife. The one who pulled out the knife replied that he loved it, all thanks to his brother's care. And now he could not only help him in the battle, but also take care of the food in the future. Then he approached the ghost guy with a rope in his hands, saying that it was good that the 3 ingredients fell into his hands. He could make the guy a ghost dish again. The guy thought it wasn't necessary after all. Last time he'd only eaten out of necessity. But then the chef said that given last time's experience, he could guarantee that this time the taste and smell would be perfect. Lin Yu decided not to refuse in such a case and said that he was very grateful to him then. Finally tying up all the ghosts, the cook said that it was even a pity that only 3 ghosts had been battered. Still too few to cook several dishes. Shaking his head, Lin Yu replied with an eager smile that perhaps that wasn't the case. The next moment, a huge ghost with a bat appeared in the stairwell, frowning to ask who dared to touch his subordinates. One of the ghosts in the bundle immediately cheered up and said that finally the boss had come over their dead bodies. However, Lin Yu paid no attention to them and looked at the cook trembling with anger, who pulled out a knife and headed for the ghosts on the stairs, telling him he'd be right there, just dealing with them. After a while, the cook dealt with the boss as well, after which he told the guy that they were going to have a feast tonight. The latter, in turn, handed him a box, saying that he had bought 2 bottles of good wine and other ingredients, so he was counting on the cook. The cook immediately cried from such generosity, not forgetting to thank the guy for it, which answered nothing and moved up the stairs, thinking that the elevator lobby was crowded, so the chef had better keep a low profile for now. The other ghosts she passed by only stared at them fearfully, not daring to say anything against them, so the guy put his hands behind his back and, walking up the stairs, said it was a very peaceful journey. Finally, they reached the top floor, where this time there was a partition that said it was for members only. Without thinking long, Lin Yu immediately applied the card to the right place. Afterward, he walked inside, marveling with the cook at how poshly done everything was in there. The cook remarked that there was a powerful artifact there that spread against the laws of physics, and Lin Yu pronounced that it was indeed luxurious. Afterward, he headed to his room without wasting any time. Once inside, they were surprised to find that it was even better and more luxurious than the outside. And the guy couldn't believe his eyes. Right in front of him was a huge panoramic window that overlooked the haunted world. This was the violent and crazy ghost world. However, that was the temperament of the ghost world. There, even ghostly creatures became fodder for stronger ghosts. But on the contrary, the ghosts, constrained by the rules of the thriller, you could say were even friendly towards the human players. Suddenly, the cook caught his attention and said that the meal was being served. The guy immediately stared at the table, which had a huge number of different dishes that really looked appetizing. So he immediately praised the cook, telling him that he had done a good job and his talent was hidden in the Afterlife Inn. With an awkward scratch of the back of his head, the cook replied that it was only because the hostess was wary of him, because she was afraid he might do something to her. Pouring the wine, he served it to the lad and said that moreover he owed the progress of his skill to the master who had given him such good kitchen utensils. Lin Yu replied that there was no need for politeness and let him sit down, eat, and drink with him. After a while, night fell and a blood moon rose in the night sky. Noticing that the game had announced that there were still 3 survivors, the guy said that the first day was over and that Quan Dao and the mushroom were fine, after which he called the system and told it to open the panel. Looking at her, the guy thought that the forum had said that subduing a ghost was difficult, and the closer to the end, the more difficult it was. Either they use yin materials with extreme effects or unleash their potential in deadly situations. But for him, an almost infinite amount of money could bring an unlimited amount of yin ingredients. And with the fact that he already has Jujian, the preliminary difficulty is not an obstacle. The next instant, he remembered, too, that he might actually rummage through the side apartments of the boarding house and find some materials there. But the guy decided to restock first, so he moved confidently toward the exit. Already moving along the corridor, he met Quan Dao and the kid who was with him yesterday on his way. Seeing him, Quan Dao immediately waved his hand and said hello to him. In turn, Lin Yu also said hello and asked why he was so joyful and if something good had happened. He said that yesterday he and this kid got a bug. When asked what the bug was, the guy reminded the guy about the curfew rule and said he found a way to avoid it. Lin Yu immediately asked with interest what method it was, thinking to himself that if they also found out about the membership, he couldn't afford to be exposed. Meanwhile, the man told me that they got a hidden part-time job yesterday from an old-timer at the information center, so you can use your night pass to get around after curfew. The paychecks are higher at night after all. The kid put in his word and said that it was by working nights that he was able to save enough money to pay for the first night. Lin Yu replied that it wasn't bad, thinking that this information wasn't completely useless. At least it said that some stores were open at night. Meanwhile, the man took a hairbrush out of his pocket and said that they had been working in the store on the second floor yesterday and had received goods that had not passed quality control at staff prices. That's why even though it seems like part-time jobs are designed to make money to survive, it's actually a great opportunity for them. The guy asked him if he was going to get a job at a high-end store, thinking that if he did, he'd have to cancel his shopping plan. However, the man replied that he would not go there, and they should be able to sleep in the afternoon. However, the store manager saw how hard they were working and promised them a well-paid job today. Looking after the departing people, Lin Yu shook his head at the question of whether he would come, and thought that he already had a fortune in the trillions, so why would he still need to work? Upon arriving at the payment center, the guy quickly approached the cash register and pounded on the table, drawing the attention of an employee. Noticing that he had turned to him, the guy asked if he could transfer the balance of his original card to the new one after upgrading his status. The ghost replied that of course it could be done and took the card from him with consternation, noting that he had indeed become a dick. Then, not paying attention to the guy standing behind the glass, he quickly clicked the buttons on the keyboard. Finished with that, he turned to the guy and asked with a smile if there was anything else he needed to do. The latter did not reject anything at once and asked the system to give him 100 bills with a face value of 100,000. Then he handed the pack to the ghost, telling him to refill his balance by a million. The ghost was calmly took the money, but hearing his last words, shocked, shouted out, "Is there really a million?" The next moment he quickly pulled himself together, thinking about how he couldn't believe that he had accidentally shouted that out, and he hoped that he wasn't going to complain about it. The guy paid no attention to this and told him to hurry up and refill his account. The ghost immediately said yes and leaned over the computer, and the boy thought that these little ghosts were really like ants in a huge ghost world. After some time, the guy came to the store again and picked up a whole basket of various products. Then, coming to the cash register, I calmly handed the card to the cashier and the manager who were standing there. The manager said he couldn't believe that the VIP guest was already a member of the club because he was so young and talented, so he must be a big fan of food and wine because the young ones love them. And since he's already a member of the club recommends the restaurant upstairs. After hearing the manager say that it was more upscale, the guy said thoughtfully that it was worth going there then. The manager cheerfully said that this was indeed the case and he would ask his cousin to give him a discount. However, the guy immediately waved his hand and said that he didn't need the discount and don't let him look down on him. Thinking that this man's calmness and confidence were beyond his comprehension, the manager said that, in that case, he would tell his cousin to save for him all the most clever ingredients. Already leaving the store, Lin Yu sent the groceries to the storage room, and without much enthusiasm, he thought that it looked like he was going to have a drink at a nice restaurant tonight. After a while, he finally arrived in the elevator to the 26th floor and headed for his rooms. Already approaching it, the guy was not surprised to notice a girl standing there who immediately said hello to him. This shocked him, and he immediately thought that she had really come for him. She immediately introduced herself and said that her name was Bai, and she was the secretary of the 5th counselor of the otherworldly boarding house. She decided to meet him tonight to discuss cooperation. Having said all, the girl asked him what he thought about it and how he felt about it. Lin Yu replied that it was no problem after all. He was planning to have dinner at the revolving restaurant tonight. And if she didn't mind, why don't they talk over dinner? The girl asked him to wait a moment and pulled out some sort of pendant hanging around her neck. After she activated it, the guy thought it must be some kind of phone. Finally, the girl put the pendant back and said that the counselor said they would wait for him at 10 o'clock in a private room Red Moon on the 32nd floor. Lin Yu smilingly replied that in that case there was no problem and he would treat them to a nice dinner. Looking at him, the ghost thought with a smile that from the looks of it, this guy was really rich. She turned to leave when the guy shouted loudly and asked her to wait. The girl immediately stopped and turned around asking what he wanted. Lin Yu pointed a finger at her pendant and said that he wanted to ask how much it was roughly worth. The ghost, misunderstanding the whole thing, immediately flared up and said she wasn't selling the body and if he had special needs, he could settle for the entertainment on the 29th floor. Realizing that he had been misunderstood, the guy hurriedly explained that he only wanted to ask how much the jade pendant that allowed him to communicate at a distance cost. The ghost immediately exhaled and replied that it had been given to her by the 5th counselor and the lad could ask her tonight. And then she was gone. And looking after her, the boy thought that it seemed that in the world of ghosts, beauty was still a sin to be born. And even a decent guy like him can be misunderstood one day. But the entertainment on the 29th floor needs to be checked out too. Anyway, there will be gambling, and it's a great way to lose your money, but also a chance to practice real combat. And Versus Ipeka with 3 advisors will take place in the evening. Although it is not expected to be too dangerous, it is important to be fully prepared for it. Meanwhile, the man walked to the elevator and called the boy who had stopped halfway up, calling him Avon. The one came up and asked fearfully if they were really going to work upstairs. It must be too dangerous after all. The man told him it was a quest game and there was no safe place. It's impossible to survive another quest without taking every opportunity to become stronger. So even though this otherworldly boarding house is dangerous, a part-time job is a good opportunity for them. And what's more, if today goes well, the next day you don't have to go out. After he agreed, the man took him by the shoulders and led him into the elevator with words to not worry so much because he would eventually cover for him. Meanwhile, Lin Yu was already gambling with the other players, not really paying attention to whether he was succeeding or not. After the next game, the guy smilingly said he lost. And the other ghosts just couldn't believe that he had such a small card. And he really didn't raise the bet until the very end. At this time, the guy was thinking about the fact that these gamblers are well informed, and according to them, the background of the boarding house, the Otherworldly Council, is also quite a well-known organization in the world of ghosts. And there are 13 council members in total, and 3 of them will be there tonight, so it sounds like they're taking him seriously. Still, council members aren't his main focus while he has to find a way to spend more money tonight. After a while, the boy finally got up from the table, saying it was time to go to dinner. One of the ghosts said goodbye to him, telling him to take care of himself and that they would play with him again. Meanwhile, on the 32nd floor, guests were already gathering in the revolving restaurant. There were also waiters standing and greeting the guests, among whom were both humans and ghosts. Avon, looking under his feet fearfully, thought that they are all evil and harsh ghosts. Fortunately, there are not many customers there, really. He doesn't know if he can survive tonight. Suddenly, some ghost at the table called out to him, and the boy immediately stood as still as a string. Meanwhile, the ghost tapped the glass and told him to come over and pour the wine into it. The guy immediately came over and, taking the bottle in his hands, said okay. The ghost looked at the approaching guy and asked if he was human. This question frightened him a lot. The boy immediately trembled and tried to answer and say that he was not human. But the ghost asked that if it wasn't, why the one smelled like a fresh cutlet. Meanwhile, the kid stared fearfully at the bottle from which he was pouring wine. It seemed to him that a snake was crawling out of that bottle little by little. Suddenly its snake rushed towards his face with a loud hiss, which made him fearfully let the bottle out of his hands. The ghost, on the other hand, watched with a peaceful smile as the bottle was about to break, anticipating eating this kid. However, to his surprise, a second waiter immediately jumped up and grabbed the bottle by the neck. Wiping up the spill, he smiled awkwardly and apologized for his colleague, saying he was a bit clumsy. The kid behind him, meanwhile, thought fearfully that he had just succumbed to an illusion. After all, if he had ruined his clothes, he could have just taken advantage of the situation and eaten him. But luckily, Quandao's brother came in time. The ghost, meanwhile, yelled for him not to think this was the end of it, because that bottle was worth a lot of money, and as compensation he wants the kid's thigh. Quandao replied that they would compensate him for the bottle. But since we're going to do this, we'll have to follow the owner's rules. Thinking that the restaurant owner was not an easy person to deal with, the ghost turned and motioned for him to come over. Noticing that he didn't fit either, the ghost stared in wonder at what was happening there. The owner greeted the guy, who walked in with a smile, offering him passage. And calling him an honored guest, he said he'd heard a lot about him from his cousin, so he was very pleased to see him there with the members of the council. The ghost girl behind the guy's back said that the council members would be arriving soon, so he should follow him to the Hall of the Red Moon. Walking further, the guy stared shocked at the 2 waiters, who stared at him just as shocked. What they saw just made their jaws drop. Lin Yu immediately thought that this was where they appeared to be working, and it looked like they were in a mess. He asked the owner what had happened. He said that it seemed to be a surprise, but that he would go and take care of it. The guy walked forward with the words that he would go with him and they would watch together. Ghost pointed at the waiter and grudgingly said that idiot can't even hold a bottle in his hands. So what's the point of having him, and why shouldn't he eat it? The host wanted to tell what kind of guest he was, but the guy interrupted him and asked how much the bottle cost. Ghost said he doesn't even have a second rank, so he just doesn't deserve to talk to him. The guy turned to the owner and asked how such an unqualified customer could sit in a restaurant. Then he asked again how much his wine cost. The owner replied that the wine cost 600 minbi. While the ghost was asking if he could pay for it, Lin Yu ordered 10 bottles of such wine. The owner immediately began to persuade the guy not to get angry and not to hurry to pay because he would serve him first. The ghost wondered in shock what the hell was going on in there and if the owner of the restaurant really knew him. Meanwhile, the waiter brought wine, whereupon that ghost said that paying him back with 10 bottles of wine was very sincere. Not that he could pardon him, but still. Taking one of the bottles, the guy said he thought too much of himself if he thought he'd be paid back with it. Then he came closer and swung the bottle with all his might, immediately bringing it down and smashing it with force against the ghost's head. At the sight of this picture, everyone around stared at the guy in shock, not understanding why he did it at all. The kid covered his mouth fearfully, thinking that he had just dared to hit the stern ghost, and the man on the contrary was happy, and said that Fengdu's brother was good, and he didn't think he was the VIP guest of the revolving restaurant. Meanwhile, Ling Yu himself was looking at the ghost he himself had just punched with an evil smile. The one glared back at him angrily, trying to say something. But without saying anything, he rushed towards the guy with a loud scream, wanting to kill him. In turn, the guy immediately released the energy-filled Pharaoh's bandage towards the ghost flying towards him. Who didn't notice something wrong at the wrong time, he wouldn't have gotten out of there. The stone-faced guy yanked the piece of bandage that was closer to him. The ghost immediately found himself bound and wrapped in a bandage like a cocoon. However, it wasn't enough, and the guy immediately sent a few more magic nails flying in his direction, who immediately nailed the no longer resisting ghost to the chair about which he was standing. After the guy did so, he immediately summoned the Pharaoh's blindfold back onto his arm. Ignoring the ghost's screams, he took another bottle and said that he deserved to die, and with the words that he was buying him a treat, swung around again and hit him over the head with the wine bottle with force. While everyone else continued to stare at this picture in horror, the owner approached the guy and held out a towel, offering to wipe his hands. Meanwhile, the guy turned to the other people and asked if they wanted to try doing that. The two of them looked at each other and, smiling, immediately agreed that they would like to try it. The next instant, they began smashing bottles of wine over the ghost's head, imploring him to help himself to it. In the end, when there were no more bottles left, all the squint could do was beg for mercy. Then the fellow came quickly up to him and, saying well, put his hand to his head and promised that he would give him a quick death. In the next instant, several nails passed through the ghost's body, thus finishing it off. Meanwhile, the other people said that the old ghost was a jerk, and this time, thanks to him, they were able to get rid of him. They called him an ancestor and said they would never forget his kindness and would always look up to him. The kid tried to say that he wasn't an ancestor, but the man interrupted him, saying that he understood that the Fengdu brother wanted to keep a low profile, so he would keep his secret when he got out. The boy promised the same. Looking at them, Lin Yu half thought that it didn't matter anymore. After all, it wasn't really something that could be explained. Turning to the owner, he immediately apologized for the murder in their establishment. He in turn replied that it didn't matter, after all, such a low-ranking client was not worth his apology, and he had done him a favor. At that, he thought to himself that this teenager wasn't just rich, as his cousin used to say. This is a man with a strong arm. The ghost, the girl thought he didn't use his spirit power, but he was wielding 2 yin artifacts, so he must be hiding his power. That's right, the rules of the ghost world forbid ghost lords with such power from entering. So the 5th counselor's conclusion is indeed correct. This guy's a teenager, apparently a really high-level ghost. The next moment, she pointed him down the aisle and, saying that he had been working hard, remarked that he should eat more too. Sitting down at the table, the guy immediately started looking at the price tags that were on the menu. After a bit of thought, he said that these meals and drinks were not in keeping with his status as a councilman. And then he asked if there was something with a higher price, like a set meal or something like that. The owner replied that he taught them a lesson and the menu was really going nowhere, so the restaurant could come up with something new. Then he offered the guy to look at some combinations and was about to say he'd give him a discount, but the guy Z coughed. And then the host shouted that there would be no discount, it would be an 18-course table for 108888 yuan. The guy hummed contentedly at that price tag, agreeing with the choice. And then he asked about non-drinks and if there were any restaurant specialty drinks or century-old wines. After all, he wanted the most expensive kind. The master looked away and hesitated briefly, not knowing what to say, then said that the best wine he had there was the wedding wine that was meant for his talentless brother. In response to his saying that if the guy wanted it, he would give it up for 100,000, the guy responded poshly and held out his card for payment. Sistema immediately announced that he had completed the task and could collect his reward for the task. And then there was another task that was different from the past ones. Now, his shopping for huge sums had to be done in front of more than 100 spectators. Looking at him, the guy thought the assignments were getting more complicated. not just to spend $1 million, but to get 100 people around him. Apparently, he's so introverted that the system makes him play in front of everyone. Feeling the stares on him, the guy immediately turned around in surprise at the ghost girl behind him. She closed her eyes and smiled as she moved closer to the table, and immediately poured coffee for the guy, thinking that dinner cost 200,000 yuan and this guy must have a monstrous past. Meanwhile, the council members had already arrived and were making their way into the restaurant. The ghost girl immediately bowed and greeted the 5th, 9th, and 13th counselor. Out of respect for those who had come, the boy got up from his seat and looked in their direction, but did not bow. Looking at the 2 counselors being served by the 5th, the guy thought that the 9th and 13th, both stronger than the female secretary, were on the level of a stern ghost, while the 5th one was much stronger than the 2 of them, and he seemed to belong to the same class of ferocious ghosts as Zhu Zhang. He looked at the ghosts sitting at the table and immediately greeted them. One of them said that he must be the VIP guest of room 2643. The guy immediately replied that it was correct and they could call him Emperor Fengdu. The ghosts immediately looked at him shocked, not understanding how anyone could even come up with such a ridiculous name. Meanwhile, Lin Yu sat down in his seat and asked if they were going to dine in their robes. The ghost in the red robe said that indeed, since Emperor Fengdu was so sincere, they would no longer hide. And then she took off her hood first. And the guy looking at her remembered that the secretary had said that the 5th was actually a girl. The other 2 ghosts immediately followed suit and removed their hoods as well while saying nothing, watching the secretary walk up to the girl and say something to her. The guy thought that she must be telling her about what he had just done in the restaurant. Now she wouldn't dare to take him lightly after what he had done. Meanwhile, the girl thought that this guy was definitely not a human ghost lord. He could be an expert of the inner world of ghosts under the command of some ghost king, and they, the council, are also connected to the great powers controlled by the ghost king. So it looks like this Fengdu emperor wants to give them a hand of cooperation. So she turned to the guy and said that apparently the ghost king's power behind his excellency had asked him to come to them. And so she wondered if that meant they wanted to work very closely with him. The boy nodded without stopping to smile, thinking that this little girl had a brilliant mind. The girl told him that in that case they should go straight to business. After all, his power and financial capabilities are huge, and his methods are insidious and mysterious, which is fascinating. Regardless, they still need to call a meeting to discuss everything, so she suggests they start with small collaborations. The guy nodded his head again and said that was exactly what he was thinking, and then, offering to be honest, asked what they could offer them and what the guy could offer them in return. The girl said that he must have chosen the council because of their intelligence capabilities in the outer strongholds and the income of the minbis. The work of other organizations and the activities of human hunters are under their control. The guy thought that the guest house was clearly working on a system that was designed to make money. That's why he said that he was not interested in the minbi, but only in information, and then said with a smile that outsiders are getting more interesting in their time. The ghosts immediately thought about the fact that they were actually right, which was surprising. The girl said that they had nothing to lose by sharing information with His Excellency, but there were still many restrictions due to the fact that they were in another country. The guy immediately replied that it was no problem and he would be there for them in their time of need. The girl immediately exhaled and said with a smile that she was calm in that case. It made the guy wonder if ghosts really do trust each other so easily. And if so, is it because of the influences of the ghost world's rules? Meanwhile, the girl called Bai's secretary over to her and gave her something, and she in turn immediately took it to the guy, asking him to accept it. The girl immediately explained that what she was holding in her hand was their council badge, and with this badge all of the estates and branches will be at his disposal. And as of today, he is an honorable member of the council. At this moment, the waiters came in with the dishes, who immediately said that dinner was served and wished them a pleasant appetite. The guy immediately raised his filled wine glass and made a toast, wishing them a fruitful collaboration. Everyone immediately stood up and repeated after him, raising their glasses and wishing the same. The next moment, the guy turned to Secretary Bai, standing aside, and told the 5th counselor that he thought he needed to have some sort of connection with her. Secretary Bai, in turn, lowered her head in embarrassment and stared at the floor. The girl in turn turned her attention to her as well, and then said with a smile that Emperor Fengdu has a good eye because Secretary Bai is really good at business. The boy tried to justify himself and say that he didn't mean it, but the girl had already said that since he was new in the business and didn't have a competent assistant, she would let her follow him. Lin Yu shook his head, awkwardly thinking that he actually just wanted the jade pendant. But then he still decided to do a favor for the other side of the table. Meanwhile, the girl asked if His Excellency had a contract. The guy replied that of course he had one, and it immediately materialized in his hands. Secretary Bai, in turn, immediately took it and signed where she was supposed to stand. Lin Yu extended his hand with a smile, wanting to take the contract, and said that she would now have to follow him. The girl didn't answer anything and only smilingly handed him a contract that said she was voluntarily serving Mr. Lin. After a while, when the meal was over, it was time to say goodbye, and the girl said that they would leave everything as it was. And if he needed anything, he could just ask. The guy in turn folded his hands in a respectful gesture and replied that they too, if they encountered difficulties, let them apply, thinking to himself that he still had the right to help or not. As soon as the doors closed, the girl said that of course their actions had gotten more brazen, and they would certainly be followed by an internal force. One of the counselors replied that he still didn't understand. The cost of the whole boarding house was several tens of millions. How could such a big shot be attracted in the first place? In turn, the girl said thoughtfully that she had been in the inner part, where the rules were much harsher than there, and noted that they had already mastered the method of penetrating the human world. And maybe that's the very reason why they focus on their organization specifically. After a while, the guy returned to his room, where Secretary Bai immediately served him his coffee. Looking at her characteristics, the guy thought that compared to Zhu Jiang, her panel was a bit inferior. But the harsh ghosts were more suitable for public use for him right now. She also has a knack for dealing with things he doesn't know about. With the conclusion of the contract, her loyalty to him would gradually surpass her loyalty to the council. At this moment, the girl thought that only by following Mr. Lin Yu could she make the right choice. The next moment, the guy frowned and asked the system to open his panel. When he looked at it, he was both surprised and pleased at what it said. For a feast worth 200,000, it wasn't bad after all. Thanks to him, he had quietly advanced to the second rank and even almost halfway to the third rank. And also his power of a rank 2 Ghost Lord is much greater than before, so he can easily destroy an equal ghost. And on top of that, there were rewards for simply completing the task in the form of a soul-destroying talisman. So now he could definitely see that the Minbi's strength had finally transformed into his combat power. After one day, the quest was finally over, and the guy, along with the ghosts, packed for the exit. Still now, from this quest, he was returning to the real world not by himself, but already with the loot. After a while, he and Secretary Bai came to a huge house outside the city, which surprised the guy. The guy said with a smile, reminding Secretary Bai that the day before yesterday he gave her 10 million and she only took this house for 3 million. She replied that his requirements were privacy, space, and lack of disturbance, which was why she had taken the cottage. After all, the previous owner had committed suicide there, and there were rumors that his ghost roamed there, so the price was very low. While the girl was saying that she had sputtered and there were no ghosts there, the guy thought that even if there were, he could spend more money. After a moment, Lin Yu turned to her and smilingly praised her, saying that she'd done a great job. The secretary in turn embarrassedly replied that it was part of her job, thinking about the fact that the 5th counselor never praised her, even though she was good to her. As she followed the boy, she continued to say that she had also gathered information about the human hunters and the bow games. The third and final game he would participate in next time, the final game for all newcomers. The guy said he heard you can add friends after you pass the rookie stage. Secretary Bai replied that moreover, players will be given full access to the space of the thriller, and that is why the difficulty of the third quest will not be the same as in the first 2. It comes to the point that on the third quest, the survival rate of players does not reach 30%. Lin Yu frowned and said that he wouldn't take it lightly. There was still more than a week to go, so they should have a good rest. After a while, he set up a gym and said that at this time they would be his sparring partners. The first time they fought, the guy couldn't take one light punch from the cook. From there, they learned together with the secretary to confront him. And in the end, Lin Yu still learned how to control some artifacts in combat conditions. In the meantime, for all these trainings and classes, the guy did not notice how the last quest approached. After a while, the game transported all the players to the train and welcomed them into the game. The name of the quest was Train Under Nova 44, and its goal to arrive at the final destination by train. Reading that the current survivors in the quest are 15, the guy sat down in his seat on the train. Looking around, he thought that, as expected from the last rookie challenge, There were as many as 15 of them this time. He wondered how many would survive the quest. Suddenly, an announcement was heard that welcomed them to the train number 44, and also asked them to behave well and observe the norms of behavior in the train. After listening to everything, the guy immediately thought with a smile that it was still worth it to see how treacherous this third quest could be. After a while, a convector started walking through the carriage and announcing the rules, as well as selling and checking tickets. Looking at his ticket, the guy thought that while it might seem like there were only 5 rules, there was no peace of mind inside a train with so much fish and chips. Suddenly, he heard some sort of shouting from outside, which made him raise his head and look in that direction. To his surprise, there was a man sitting there who did not want to negotiate with the conductor. Looking at this scene, one of the ghosts said, "They're just ungrateful people." And the guy thought this flight attendant was actually on the level of a severe ghost. Players who have survived to the third quest should still have experience, as this man could so quickly get into an altercation with a harsh ghost. The conductor told the man that the instructions clearly stated that all passengers, whether human or ghost, must sit with a ticket. The man grudgingly showed her the ticket and said he had it, so why was she picking on him? She explained that he might have a ticket, but the ghost on his leg didn't. He lowered his head and stared at his leg in shock, unable to believe she'd noticed. Meanwhile, the conductor said there are fines for train violations. The man apologized and said he would just issue another ticket in that case, and then asked how much it cost. After looking in the magazine, the conductor apologized and said in a creepy voice that there were no extra tickets. After that, an eerie aura began to activate around her, looking at which the man frightenedly asked if she was a harsh ghost. The woman immediately headed in his direction with a creepy smile, saying that passengers who don't have a ticket will be kicked off the train. The man tried to confront her, but it didn't work, and the conductor ended up just ripping his leg off and throwing it out the window. Listening to him scream in pain, the guy thought it was not bad for the third quest. After all, who would have thought me that even drained ghosts need a ticket? But really, that rule is a trap in and of itself. Looking at the guide, the guy thought that it seemed like he wouldn't be able to summon Zhu Jiang at will. It wasn't for nothing that he had mastered the use of power to fuel himself in battle, so dealing with ordinary evil spirits wasn't a problem for him. Finally, the conductor approached him and held out her hand, saying it was a ticket check. The guy gave her his ticket and said that since there were no regular tickets left, how about a more expensive ticket? After checking his ticket, the conductor replied that everything was correct and the seats for them were already sold out. And as for private rooms, one stop costs at least 1,000 minbi. So does he really think he can afford to spend that much? Taking his ticket and looking at it, the guy thought that as expected, there are no ghosts in this world who don't recognize money. Thinking that this guy could not be so calm, the conductor said that to get an upgrade, he should go to the 5th car at the next stop. She then checked the last of her tickets and exited the carriage, closing the door behind her. As soon as she came out, it was as if the ghosts took off their shackles and started fighting amongst themselves. One of the girls sitting near the ghosts shook fearfully as she listened to them ask if anyone needed fresh blood. The 2 ghosts stood up and looked around the wagon looking for someone to play with. After eventually choosing 3 people, including that girl, a man without a leg, and a guy, the ghost told them to play with them. The other 2 joined him and began to ask that they play, and if not, let them not show their faces again. One of the ghosts, looking at those approaching, said that these people were in danger of being attacked by 3 evil ghosts. The guy, meanwhile, thought it was even interesting. 3 little ghosts daring to take the initiative to provoke him. As he came closer, he asked how much a single batch cost. The ghost replied that one game is worth 10 minbis and they play until it gets fun. And if they don't have minbis, they can use everything up to their souls to pay off their debts. Laughing, the guy agreed and, sitting down across from the ghost, told him to be less vain and get down to business. All 3 ghosts did not understand the reason why he was so sure, and therefore stared at him uncomprehendingly and angrily. Meanwhile, one of the ghosts had already started shuffling cards with a nasty grin. The 2 remaining men were so shaken that the ghosts asked what they were afraid of. If they played, they could take their minbis and should look forward to it. Both men answered nothing and turned to the guy, trying to figure out why the hell he was so calm. After a while, the ghost finally put the cards down on the table and Immediately, they were distributed and every couple pieces went to the masters. Lin Yu was surprised and quickly stopped the flying cards and caught his own. Upon looking at them, however, disappointment befell him, and so he turned to the remaining people and thought that it looked like the man was luckier than the girl. However, looking at those ghosts and their behavior, it was clear that they were confident in their victory. One of the ghosts who led the game did not wait long, and so with a smile told them to reveal their cards. The people were the first to unfold the cards, and since they didn't know what kind of cards the ghosts had, everyone was tense. Looking at their maps, the ghosts looked as if they expected it, and so mockingly said it was quite bearable. Then with a laugh, they turned their cards to them, confident of their victory. Looking at these cards, even the man was afraid after all to win. Even with his own cards, he could not succeed. The boy in turn threw the cards on the table, thinking that there was no justice to the game the spirits used to entertain people. One of the ghosts who had the best cards immediately held out his hand and told them to hand over the money. The other ghosts immediately praised him and said that he was very lucky to be giving their money away. The man in turn barely collected the necessary sum and held it out to the ghosts, who were clearly unhappy with what they saw and asked if that was all they had. The girl kept holding out money, saying she only had 5 minbis. The ghost immediately took the money, along with it immediately ripping off one of the girl's fingers, who at first did not understand anything, but looking at her trembling hands frightened, said that her finger was missing. After which she started to shout, but Lin Yu quickly gagged her with an apple, silencing her. After which, in a cautionary tone, he told her not to yell because she would attract the attention of the conductor and she obviously didn't want the consequences. Holding up her finger, one of the ghosts said that if there was no money, yin materials and everything flesh to soul would do to cover debts. Whereupon all the ghosts turned toward the lad and mockingly asked him what was up and if it was his turn. The guy smiled in turn, asking to himself how dare they put pressure on him, and then activating the necklace he had around his neck and directing the energy towards the ghosts. The energy from this necklace immediately enveloped the ghosts and began to get under their skin, causing them to feel fear and confusion. After a while, the ghosts asked each other what was going on and why they felt like they were being chased by someone strong. And it definitely wasn't the conductor, so they wondered if it was the kid across from them. Looking at the girl thanking the guy for the apple, one of the ghosts thought that whether this apple had the effect of signing yin. Meanwhile, the guy held out 100 minbi, saying he didn't have a smaller denomination, but they obviously need the money. The ghost to whom he held them out was a little wary of taking them, not knowing what to say. So they were immediately snatched up by another ghost and placed on the table with the words that he was right. And since they had nothing to do, they would play again. Looking at the guy looking at them with a smile, the ghost thought that Minbi's Setnia and the apple were clearly related to the yin artifact that he keeps with him. And it seems that this hunter has become quite arrogant. So the ghost thought he should be sure to roast him on the fire and bleed him to the last drop before eating him. Then he said that 10 minbai is too little, and so they raised the rate to 100. The other ghosts immediately agreed with him and said they would start with 100, and that way they wouldn't back down. To the surprise and shock of the other people, the guy readily agreed and said he didn't see any problem with it, except that these goons who play with them won't be able to pay anything, and because of them he had to play at such a low rate, and he just can't afford to lose that much time. Looking at the two men, he immediately waved his hand in disgust and told them to go from there. Both the man and the girl looked at him as if he were a god and thanked him, saying they would never forget his kindness. Looking at them, Leave the ghosts grudgingly said that in that case they would only play with him. One of them immediately picked up and started shuffling cards with the words that in that case they would start the second round. Looking at the deck, the guy was already starting to guess that it wasn't just a deck but an artifact. After a while, the ghost placed the deck on the table. The cards were again distributed and went to their masters, and the lad immediately caught 2 fingers of his own. When he looked at them, the guy immediately realized what was going on and thought that everything was so simple that he didn't see the need to play with them anymore. Putting the cards on the table, he stood and said that 100 minbis was too little after all. The ghosts immediately grudgingly asked him how he could even do such a thing and deceive them, and whether he had decided to spoil the men's pleasure. However, the guy did not respond to their claims and took out a wad of money and offered to play now for 1,000 minbi. For a while the wagon sank into silence, and afterward the ghost asked how it was at 1,000. The other ghosts started talking to each other. I can't believe this guy's having a hard time, because these ghosts are regulars on the 44 train, and what does this man expect to do by challenging them? Someone said who the hell knows what he's counting on, but why does he think it's okay to go up against 3 ghosts at the same time? The ghosts he was playing with looked at him uncomprehendingly, thinking he was a rather troubled kid. One of the ghosts said quietly that 1,000 was a risk and that maybe they should stop. And he told him to be a dragon because in the ghost world, if you slack off, you get killed. The ghost who was shuffling the cards said that if he wanted to bet 1,000, he had a smart mouth. and he didn't care what trick he was going to pull because they had to finish that game first, before anything else comes out of here. Then the guy hid the money back. You said he'd play with it. Looking at the other ghosts, he told them not to worry because he wanted to have fun, too. Then the ghost took the cards again and answered that in that case it was good and he wished him a pleasant game. He thought to himself that he was just a brainless man, and he would let him die with a clear conscience. He then began to fill the cards with his dark energy before beginning to shuffle them. He thought they were poker cards with energy and yin, and it is enough to enter your energy into them, and immediately you can change the suit and numbers on the card at will. The guy continued to watch in silence as he shuffled the cards. Ghost, meanwhile, was thinking with a smile that even if he got lucky with the cards, it wouldn't help him any. Meanwhile, the guy was thinking about the fact that even if he didn't have enough energy to mobilize all the actions of the system, he could still realize that the face of the map could be changed. Plus, her connection to evil ghosts is particularly close to me. This deck is actually on natal artifact Yin. While he was thinking, the ghost stopped shuffling the cards and dealt them again. And the guy was thinking about the fact that winning this and playing still goes to whoever has the cards with the most yin. Ghost didn't waste any time and told them to open their cards already. The lad was in no hurry to open his own and first summoned the cook, who immediately responded to his call. And understanding him without words, he pointed his hand in his direction, sharing his yin energy with him. Watching the card fill with energy, the guy thought that the ghost contract allowed him to call upon the power of the ghost he was contracted with. But he realized he could only use 1/10 of his power right now. But still, with training, that number will increase. Meanwhile, his yin spiritual power continued to increase and filled the cards until it reached 4,015. Then the guy threw the cards on the table after all and offered to open up. The rest of the carriage stared at him in shock, not understanding where he could have gotten so much strength from. The ghosts thought that he shouldn't have it because he was only a level 2 hunter after all. The guy's cards immediately fell next to the cards of that ghost, who immediately rushed to retrieve his own, thinking that it was simply impossible for the power he had poured into those cards to disappear. Looking at his cards and their suits, the ghost thought that these were definitely not the cards he was swapping for, and judging by the way the other two looked at him, their situation was no better. Meanwhile, the guy asked what was wrong and if they had bad cards, and then he showed me his, saying that he's the one with the small ones. The other ghosts had no choice but to show their maps, which were a world even shallower than the guy's maps. The ghost with red hair thought that if he was really the one who changed cards, and how come he was only a second-ranked hunter? Putting the cards on the table, the ghost immediately jumped up from his seat and thought that maybe he had used some trick to increase his power, but for a while. Saying that he was lucky this time, the ghost gave him the money, thinking that in fact he wouldn't last long if he kept playing, and then he would get all his money. The rest of the ghosts immediately exhaled, thinking that this was what they had expected from their brother, and if they were in his place, that guy would have left them with their noses out of joint. So with words for him to take and calling him an asshole, they gave him all the money they had. Meanwhile, the guy offered to play them as they did for 100, thinking that he was no longer offering to play for 1,000, and obviously his receiver was about to run out. The ghost agreed and said he wanted him to bet everything he had this time. At the same moment, one of the passengers exhaled and, waving his hands, said that they were asking for their own death. The others backed him up and said that this was really true, and the cheeky little man is already mad with greed and apparently really thinks he can win. Ghost picked up the cards again and began shuffling them with a smile, announcing the third round, putting them on the table but angrily thinking that if he just changed the face of the card, this man would lose. How in the next instant his merriment came to an end, especially when he felt that the instant he put the cards on the table, his power was wiped away. Now, looking at the guy, he felt like a goosebumps compared to him. His power was immense, and the ghost himself didn't understand how exactly he was able to unleash such power. Even the guy's smile seemed creepy as he looked down at him, as if confirming that they were going to lose again. Looking at him fearfully, the ghost thought that he was afraid that this man was not at all using any tricks to increase yin. And not even that. By the looks of this guy, it's not a person at all. Looking at him, the guy lightly asked what was wrong and told him to finally deal the cards. The other ghosts immediately said confidently that the bloody man would lose all his savings, and even if he wasn't afraid, they would rip off that mask. Their ringleader, who was shuffling the cards, to their shock trembled and grimly said they would not play. One of the ghosts asked what it was about and if he saw something unusual in this guy. The guy looked at the ghosts unhappily and asked if they weren't going to play. and then, continuing to stare at them absent-mindedly, pronounced that he was the only one who hadn't played around yet, after which he touched the cards filled with his energy with his finger. Some of the energy was immediately directed towards the ghosts, immobilizing them, and they immediately screamed that they couldn't move. Meanwhile, the system reported that the power of the ghost realm had been detected and a Sever's quality yin artifact had been discovered. Looking at the ghosts, the guy thought that the power of the ghost realm mentioned by the system must be like some kind of power that is governed by rules, and no wonder they believed in themselves so much that the passenger would not leave, because it was these cheat cards that made it easy for them to bend the rules. At first, he just wanted to teach these confessed evil spirits a lesson, but since he was given such a wonderful opportunity, he can't just leave it at that. And the restrained ghosts begged him to be lenient with her and have mercy on them. Folding his hands on his chest, Lin Yu mockingly asked why it was for him to be condescending and if they really thought they were better than humans, and then immediately ordered the cards to be dealt, and the cards themselves flew into the hands of the host's M. The guy immediately opened his cards and then put them on the table, and he had 3 aces. The ghosts had nothing to say to this because it was their clear loss, and they shudderingly never extended the money to the guy. Without removing the smile from his face, he immediately apologized and said that they were the ones who let him win. Then he said he wasn't done yet and announced round 3. The ghosts immediately cried and begged him not to do it because they had no more minbies left. The one in turn immediately reminded them that they were the ones who had said that even yin artifacts, yin blood materials, or even souls would do, so let them put everything out. All the ghosts immediately refused and said that if they continued to play, the cards would invoke the power of the rules and rip out their souls. However, the guy wasn't listening to them anymore and immediately told them to deal out the cards again. The cards flew again to those who should have had them, and immediately there were loud shouts of the guy winning again. After a while, looking at the remaining empty seats, Guy thought that for 10 handouts he took all their energy yin, and the souls themselves were unable to resist the rules of super high-quality artifact yin. And he's also just sure that the chef will also be happy to deal with this knowledge, so he's found something for him to do. Looking at the cards, the guy thought that of course not souls, the most important thing is winning. And this super high-quality artifact yin cheat cards that the system immediately announced I had automatically tied to the host. Standing up from where he was sitting, still holding the cards in his hands, he thought that with this artifact he had one more trump card. With an edge of his eye looking at him, one of the signs said that he had so easily dealt with the 3 evil spirits, which definitely said that he was a true evil man, and the other ghost said that this young man possessed a mighty strength with a cruel heart, so it was better not to try to hurt him. The man sitting next to the girl exhaled and said that if it wasn't for him, they would have definitely been killed by those 3 evil ghosts. Surprisingly, he possesses terrifying power. The girl immediately asked him to wait, as this quest is the final exam for newbies and all players must be newbies. Now the man too wondered how it was that such a strong man had enlisted among the players. As he looked at the guy walking by, he was struck by his own hunch about whether this guy wasn't a player. One of the ghosts did not look at the guy, but he was still unable to see the potential of his power. He just couldn't believe that maybe he'd gone there because of the news, just like he had. In the meantime, at the station they were approaching, some girl was already waiting for the train with her assistant, who had a huge backpack on his back. Watching the guy walk past her, the girl stood up, respectfully bowed, and thanked him for his help. The one immediately turned to her and asked her not to misunderstand because he was not some senior but an ordinary rookie player who was taking an exam. Looking at how the man calmly exhaled with relief, the guy even wondered if they had gotten the idea that he came from some noble family of ghosts. Looking at him, the other people thought that this man's charisma could not belong to an ordinary person, and they were afraid that only a person like him would feel like a fish in the water in this game. All the people all immediately went to him asking for advice on how they could survive this quest and what they should do. One of the men showed him the ticket and asked him to look at it with the words that he had just familiarized himself with the route of train 44. Their task is to get to the final station between the world of the living and the dead, but the travel ticket is calculated only to the station of the trace bones to the goal is missing 4 stops. The guy replied that it seems that the first difficulty of the main task is just that. And according to the rules, if they want to complete the task, they need to buy a ticket to the station, or find a way to get past the ghosts without a ticket, which naturally complicates the task. The other people looked at him fearfully, asking how it was because they didn't even have that much strength, yes, and this quest has extremely strong ghosts. Looking at the way they looked at him fearfully, the guy smiled and said that since they had already gotten there, they had some experience, and since the carriage was quiet, the best way to deal with it was to watch the changes. Turning his back to them, he said that since the quest had started, the main task was not long in coming. Only after they had figured out the rules and hidden patterns, they had the opportunity and confidence to choose their own actions. One of the men immediately exhaled calmly and said that this was expected of an expert because such calmness was admirable. Listening thanks guy sat down in his seat thinking about the fact that even if you study the rules of the quest correctly and find a hole in them, still need to have enough strength to break through. And before the dangerous and strange third quest, it is he who must keep in the shadows and save up his strength just in case, after all, he does not know what can happen. Suddenly the train stopped and all the ghosts looked up in surprise. The boy, who had been oblivious to this, turned his head and looked in surprise toward the passageway. The other signs feel energy said it's such a cold energy they even wonder what's going on because didn't they say train 44 is folding with its safety? One of the players who had previously noticed that the train was going to the final station, but their tickets were not going to the final station, immediately started sweating. But noticing Lin Yu's calmness, he thought that as expected of a ghost from a great family, he was holding his own even in the midst of such a strange conduct. Lin Yu himself glanced back with an edge of his eye, thinking that looking at the reactions of the ghosts, this was not at all like a normal situation on train 44. But if he wasn't mistaken, then right in front of him mined a powerful ghost when he played the map. And why would a minor ghost get on a low-level wagon so the matter smells fried? One of the ghosts, looking straight ahead, immediately said they had come without stopping to look that way. He looked at him in surprise and thought that he had been waiting for this, and that the ghost he was hiding was going to transform, but he wasn't going to give it to him. Having prepared the artifacts, Ling Yu thought that this was what was expected from a beginner's exam quest. There was a real cataclysm going on in this carriage. But all of a sudden, a girl appeared from the passageway, and this energy was emanating from her. With a disgruntled exhale, she walked forward and asked loudly if the gentleman wished to make a purchase. All the low-level ghosts have already hung up like they've been waiting for this. However, there were also those ghosts who simply remained silent and looking at him and therefore said nothing. Looking at her just like everyone else, the guy thought this woman was using tech to possess a human, then activated the system, which informed him that a yin artifact of the first-rank yin sapphire tube of the imprisonment of unacquainted souls had been discovered. This made him whistle in surprise because he had never seen rank 1 artifacts before, and he might still be able to accidentally obtain a super-quality artifact right now. But speaking even casually, even a powerful cook like Zhu Jiang wouldn't refuse a rank 1 class artifact. So he wondered what these two were really selling, and after listening to the songs, he wondered if they were selling artifacts. Suddenly, the entire train staff, led by the train driver, appeared in the aisle. They immediately bowed to the girl and said in unison that Train 44 heartily welcomed Mistress Lu of Qingming Chamber of Commerce. Without raising his head, the driver said that according to the rules, representatives of chambers of commerce can't enter the cars. So he just waited for her there and apologized for saying that. But rules are rules. The girl replied that she does not care, Moran, their security of her business anyway are clearly not people. Moreover, she trusts him. And what's more, the Train 44 has been in operation for years, and they're not all young, so they'll probably be able to take care of her. Those in turn bowed again and said in unison that they would make every possible effort to do so. Then the driver took a walkie-talkie and told the passengers that the lady in front of them was the mistress of the Qingming Lu Chamber, and she had come to take care of business. During the journey, the hostess will show them rare goods and interested parties can have fun bidding for themselves, and once the sales are over, the Chamber of Commerce will leave them. One of the ghosts immediately said that they had a frightening yin energy, and this was the first time that the 44 train had stopped to pick up a passenger and they hadn't even bought tickets. Another ghost told him that it was a mysterious chamber of commerce and he thought that this organization existed only in legends. But here, he saw for himself. The third ghost, on the other hand, said that they say what kind of chamber of commerce appeared on the periphery of the ghost world not to kill people or hunt ghosts, but for business and wealth. But who knew they would appear on train 44? The boy thought it was no wonder there were so many ghosts in the carriage. Apparently they had heard the news about the Chamber of Commerce before they arrived. It's a chamber of commerce, and the fact that the evil spirits went there in droves is a great opportunity. But it just so happens that they conduct their business through an auction. And he knew for a fact that the lowest bidder doesn't win at an auction, but the highest bidder does, and it looked like he was destined to come out of the shadows after all. The girl sighed and walked inside the wagon, opening a portal right in front of the surprised ghosts. Inside this portal, a table has appeared on which the lots will later be laid out. The guy looking at her thought that the Chamber of Commerce had a lot of influence in the ghost world, so one should look forward to the auction. As soon as the first lots were on the table, everyone looked at them in surprise, and the guy thought that it is really the lots of the first round, then told the system to value these lots as much as possible. Meanwhile, the girl summoned the lamp and said she would start with naught. It was a dried lamp, a consumable of the third rank and medium quality. The oil contained in it can help the user to improve after lighting. But just as everyone knows, increasing yin knowledge is difficult, and the dried lamp can simultaneously increase the speed of power development and yin knowledge, which will have a significant impact on the ghost level and below. The ghosts immediately shouted that it was a consumable that could increase the intensity of the training and also effectively increase knowledge. Looking at her, the guy thought that the system gave literally the same description, and to understand the consumables and such details means that the Chamber of Commerce conducts identification of objects much better than people. One of the ghosts who wanted to buy this lamp asked the hostess how much she was selling this oil lamp for. The girl immediately easily replied that it was a dried-up, medium-quality, third-rank lamp. Its starting price was 50,000 minbi. All the signs immediately began to name their prices, which differed only slightly from each other. Suddenly, one time, Zykov came up confidently and said he was giving 60,000 for this lamp. Another ghost almost at the end of the carriage came up and grudgingly said he didn't think 60,000 was much and then said he would pay 63,000. Looking at them, the boy thought with a chuckle that it seemed that not all spirits were poor like those three gamblers. But still, even those bets that didn't shout out compared to his system and capabilities are just nothing. After sitting like that for a while and listening to their bids, the guy stood up and confidently said that he was giving 150,000 for this lamp. Everyone immediately looked at him in surprise and fell silent. They didn't think anyone would bet that much. The ghost who left 60,000 thought that he had raised twice his bet, and how could anyone make a bet like that? The girl said that this is what was expected from the expert, and the man, frightened, said that they can't even get money to buy a ticket, and he spends 150,000 on some consumable. However, the auction girl didn't care and started calling the final price at 150,000. When no one dared to outbid him, the girl tapped the table and said the lot was sold, then used the energy to direct the lamp towards the guy who was in no hurry to reach out and take it. Once the lamp got close to him, only then did he pick it up. The system immediately notified him that a rank 3 medium quality consumable had been detected, and it was a dried-up lamp that was automatically bound to the user. Gimme on how the guy puts the lamp in the space vault, one of the signs thought that when he saw such cheap bling, he couldn't resist spending his money, and so he's just an idiot. Meanwhile, the guy sat back in his seat thinking that the audience was now short of 100, so he could spend 1,000,000 and accomplish his task. However, everything happens in stages, so he can only rely on the effect of the program to attract more viewers. The girl announced the next item, and it was a pearl of immaculate soul auxiliary yin artifact of the third rank of medium quality. The artifact could be used by both people without spiritual energy and ghosts of I'm power, and it had a weak freezing effect. This time I don't expect anyone to bid. The guy went first and said he was buying it and then named his price. The girl in turn, though surprised, did not argue with him, immediately selling it to him. After that, she announced the third lot of Soul Heart Jade. A second-ranked material of medium quality, its wearing helped to maintain equanimity, and was also used to make artifacts and pills with corresponding effects. The guy got up again and was the first to raise his hand, saying he was buying it, leaving no opportunity for the rest of the ghosts to make their bids. Looking at him, one of the ghosts said that he had already spent 200,000 in the first round alone, and how on earth could a second-round hunter afford to have such resources? Other signs began to whisper that he must be hiding his power, and maybe he's a core member of a fleet or something. Or maybe he's not part of an internal organization at all, and he spent so much money in the first round that they wondered if he had any money left for the second auction. Looking around, the guy thought that because of his strange behavior in the protocol wagon, even more cut off, but it was still not enough. So he knew for sure that in the second round he would fan the flames even more to get as many people to come as possible. The treasure that was now in the second round reappeared on the table. The other ghosts said that this round's treasure was much cooler than in the past. The fierce yin power in this clinic made even them scared. Picking up the bottle, the girl said that it was a bottle of blue liquid called Traceback Liquid Lot, second-rank medium quality. This liquid returned traces and had a powerful tracking effect. It was enough to apply it on the target no matter how far away it was, and it could always be tracked. And the guy thought it was actually a rare intelligence support material that would be especially useful on group operations, and he might be able to sell it to someone in the future. Meanwhile, the girls set the starting price of the first freak 30.000. All the others immediately began to raise the bids up to 400.000. Suddenly, the guy got up from his seat again and said he was giving 700,000. This time, even the girl and her assistant were surprised and frightened. They didn't expect the guy to want to buy something again. The other ghosts also looked at him fearfully, wondering if he wanted to buy out all the lots again in the second round as well.